Hi, my name is Rick Friedrich. Welcome to Truth and Heart Ministries. Today I'm going to do for the second time a presentation on this subject on devastating assumptions about life in general, energy, the body, and such subjects. So this is the focus of my life's work, both in relation to spiritual matters and also in scientific matters. So it's going to touch on both of them. It's a crossover, if you will, between my Renaissance videos and my Truth and Heart videos. And I just filmed this, but my card wasn't working, it wasn't recording. So I am going to look here and make sure that it is recording. Gives me a chance to do a little bit better. So what are we talking about today? We come into this world and most things are settled for us. All we have to do is conform to the norm and enjoy life within the limits of the status quo. Do you find that to be the case? This mindset controls everything we do and is adopted as freely as breathing the air. It is not long, however, before we experience examples where people radically differ from each other, and this observation of diversity can threaten personal conformity to the settled status quo religion of the masses. A child caught in such a conflict then starts to question things. As they become aware of the apparent contradictions, they may lose faith in this creed and dare to think and act differently. We've all seen it. And depending on the outcome of their resulting actions, they will be considered either a rebel or a genius. Can you believe that someone would dare question things? We all know this. A rebel or a genius. Or maybe a rebel genius. That's the third category. This is the reality of being born into this world today. What we want to do today is look at why this is the case with examples of how the essence of the problem results in devastating consequences in relation to energy production, and how this also affects our bodies and everything about our lives and our destinies. So what word could be used to describe that which has brought about the most evil ever? Stop and think about that for a minute. What one word could be used? It is a word that is generally passed over as trivial and considered mostly harmless or unavoidable. Yet it is the foundation for all that is wrong as we know it. And that's a pretty broad statement. It is the building block upon which all false science, philosophy, religion, and character is formed. It is also a guiding principle or methodology throughout all evil enterprises. Have you figured out what it is? No, I mean not in mere word, but the essence of it. We are all victims of the effects of this practice that is so universally prevalent that it is essentially a worldview that people are in settled conformity to. It's a worldview, a way of looking at things, the way of existing. And we have all participated in furthering its cause. If you haven't fully realized that yet, then you are still walking around blindly as one led by the mere impulse of the herd. And there is no essential difference between that and adding to the force and madness of a mob. Put yourself back into that place where you see the mob and it's just madly rushing down the road, destroying things or going to attack. not open to any reason, just going at it. Boom, you're participating in it. You're just the same. Yes, we are talking about assumptions. Begging of the question is another way of looking at the word, assuming the conclusion of anything before one ought to, or before there is sufficient reason or proof. Assume, presume, prejudge, guess, conjecture, speculate, fancy, etc., etc. We are all aware of the idea of these words, but we need to look very carefully at how universal this evil is. You must be careful in such research, however, as the more you look, the more you will find. If you do not have interest in being thorough in this research, you will necessarily be illustrating an example of it in the sister idea of confirmation bias, where you search for a conclusion you want and ignore facts within your reach or the potential possibilities you haven't bothered to search for. So you have to come to grips with that. This child I mentioned finds himself in a state of real tension, which is called cognitive dissonance. In the last video, we talked about resonance, which is basically two or more objects in harmony or sync together, in which results a greater combined or united output. So it's like we took two tuning forks and one vibrating will cause the other one to vibrate, right? And they become moving together. And I showed some other video where objects out of sync became in sync. And the power of that is greater than the two combined. It's a powerful force. So opposite of this is cognitive dissonance. When one is placed in a situation or predicament where there are two opposing choices and it feels impossible to judge between them. So two oppositely resonating forces, and you're going to be drawn to the one or the other, and you can't tell. You're not sure which one to do. They have these consequences that you can't sort through. Damned if you do and damned if you don't in your mind, right? The child in this case grows up with the mindset that conformity to the norm in all things is best. That's where you're going to have your happiness. Virtue is the mean between extremes. It's going with the flow. It's all these kinds of ideas that make, least tension, what have you, right? But when something challenges that, it becomes difficult to relate to it because of the implications. Generally, most people just continue the herd mindset and jump to a conclusion and continue on as most others do. Occasionally, however, someone says, wait a minute, and is willing to ask the question, says who? And I guess it's the way you ask the question that's important. Only a few of those people, however, who ask that says who's willing to question things, only a few of those, however, go deeper than that and attempt to search the foundations of this practice, right to the very core, right? And universally apply their findings. For most of the others get tangled into the particular issue or the matter they disagree with and get lost in the controversy itself and or have a bad reaction to it. And this we see all the time. So that there's so many that have a bad reaction because they're upset that they've been lied to or things aren't as they appear. They're so upset that they have a bad reaction and then people point out their bad reaction rather than the truth that they're bringing out. And that's how the whole deception continues to further. It's not always a framing of somebody who opposes the system, but somebody who's demonstrating a bad spirit about it at the same time. And thus anybody who opposes or questions something then gets grouped into the rebel mindset, right? The crazy conspiracy theorist or what have you, you know. Some of these people who have just found themselves stuck in issue-oriented focus, where they're all hung up at exposing darkness for its own sake, not because they're really promoting the truth, but they're all interested in controversy, they're interested in pointing the finger, and they're harsh, they're reactional religion. And many of them pride themselves that they have not been fooled as others. And in doing that, they also partake in assumptions of their own, because they haven't gone down to the real nature of things, figured out why is it, and what's implied in all of this. So there's many pitfalls and traps. Just because you can see something is wrong and many people are wrong in it, doesn't mean that you're in the right in many things yourself. For those of you who have ears to hear and eyes to see, and really want to be true detective, and get down to the nature of things, I say, join me in considering what follows in this video, because it will give you a ride of your life, I believe it. And I know that because I just said this whole thing and it wasn't recorded, so so bear with me. You may think this is one of these just simple lectures, but I go into it all here. We are not looking to take one color pill or another and look at the surface of things and fall for a sleight of hand research in this matter. Now some of you will know what I'm implying there, the pill, the blue pill, or the red pill. And in fact, the whole presentation of that was another sleight of hand, because in the end, the story was still all an illusion anyway. And the fact of the matter is that the whole idea of the movie is also not a reality. So the point is, we must get beyond the surface of things and not merely attack the final processes. We're going to talk about that throughout this whole... we need to get deep down into it. We are talking about the very start of things, where to begin, properly begin in our research. A charismatic manipulator can show you a few facts to rock your world and show you that not everything is as you thought. It can bring you to a place where you actually end up falling into a trap. Right? This is what the cults do. They use truth to draw you into something that it was essentially a complicated error with a lot of truth in it. What makes them wrong? What makes them wrong? They have a lot of truth. And that's why they're effective in gathering numbers, right? But what makes them wrong is they still do the same thing that those who they are exposing or confronting. They are still guilty of the same principle, but they're operating at the higher levels of externals. They're operating at the most obvious contradictions and what have you. And they're not willing to apply it to themselves. So the same thing essentially that makes the is-ought fallacy wrong is what they're doing. This fallacy is the idea that what is happening ought to be happening. So again, it's the whole norm, status quo, conventional way of doing things, believing things, acting way, that's the thing that they're reacting against, saying that's wrong, but they're the same. So what is ought to be, and that is ought fallacy. So what's wrong with both the cults and those who the cults oppose is that they both do not penetrate down to the foundation while adopting assumptions into their beliefs and conclusions either at the beginning or somewhere down the line. So now, I grew up in Toronto, and this is the most multicultural city in the world. It's a very intriguing city in that respect. There isn't very much racial prejudice there compared to other places because people just grow up with everyone different around them. So it's a very interesting, it was a very interesting experience for me to grow up in that. I came down to the States, been down here for half my life, and have been a part of different cultures as well, diverse cultures. So this whole subject of prejudice and assumptions means a lot to me because of my diverse background with diverse people. So once I became a Christian when I was 17, I was always talking to everybody, reaching out to them, trying to learn, because I also, while I had eternal life and I was trying to show people, help people, and give where I could, I was also receiving from everybody. I'm not afraid. I wasn't afraid to find things out and walk with people and learn from them, because I have everything to learn, and I still do. And so, all the more. And the older you get, the more you realize how little you do know. And how much you've been mistaken. Well, in that, I got involved with talking to every type of religion and philosophy and what have you, and all the cults. And within a few years I became involved in countercult ministry. In other words, helping people come out of cults, people who have been manipulated and abused, and help them get on their feet and help them with all the manipulation that, you know, to kind of deprogram them, if you will. So it's kind of a form of Christian counseling. And I went into, after that, or during that time also, was involved in other Christian counseling for people who are mentally challenged or handicapped, and physically challenged too. But during that time I was engaged in these cults, and I found it fascinating, some of the things that they would bring out, things that people weren't dare to touch in the mainstream churches that I was involved with, and even the other religions. And I found some very interesting facts which proved true. But I applied the same principle here that I'm talking about deep down to them. I said, well, what about you guys? Because I also knew about their history. More often I knew more than they did about their own religion. Not necessarily being part of it in that regards, but knowing their history, knowing their actual specific doctrines and beliefs. And so what I found was this whole hypocrisy of pointing out all these faults in others, right? But not willing to allow that to be applied to their own group. And so they were quick to point the finger and not realize that, the three were pointing back at them. Oh, maybe their thumb too, the four, pointing back at them, right? And so, but I found essentially the same thing. So when I would ask them the reason for the hope that was in them, what was it? It wasn't a real living, vital, vibrant relationship with a divine being, right? It wasn't the love of God that was constraining them. They weren't different in character. Their character was essentially the same as those who they were criticizing. The only difference was the substance of their particular issues that they differed on, and their particular authority that they held to. So what I'm saying is, you can find many charismatic leaders that will be very persuasive and awaken you to this whole, things are not as you thought they were, and then you become awakened, right? You become aware, and so you're on that, in that other sense, you've taken the pill, so to speak. But have you really taken the right pill? There's actually really a third pill that you haven't even been offered by these people, because all they want you to do is be under their control, or financially gain from them, or have their build up their ego or something like that, right? So these are the kinds of things. They give lip service to examining one's assumptions and only tolerate that towards the claims of rivals. So they'll allow you to have at it with their enemies, those they're opposed to. But no, they won't allow you to ask them the questions. Oh no, you're a goat. You're not a sheep. A sheep is only those who just receive whatever we say. But then you're just as bad as the rest, right? So this is special pleading, and it's found as everywhere as well. And it's just another example of assuming. You can do it, or I can criticize you, but you can't criticize me. I have the authority, you have none. It's not equal. There's no equals there. It's all special pleading. Absolutely assuming. Presumptuous. And it's immoral. So one must not jump on the bandwagon of someone or some cause so that merely creates awakening about some evil that group or even the majority fall victim to. Don't just jump on something because somebody has helped you see something. It's a trap, right? It's a trap. Now, in this book that I'm going to talk about Mahan later on here, he talks about here, he says, this is one of the most important quotes I memorized. So, naked air is powerless to deceive. By itself, error is not very convincing. It's not appealing, right? So it borrows all of its effectiveness from fragments of the truth with which it's associated. So that means that the truth, or the error itself, comes to you with a show of truth. And it's as powerful as the truth is presented within it. And so these people will give you a lot of truth to suck you in. And they know how to resonate with you to a certain level. And then they'll give you something, right? But it's really the poison Kool-Aid in the end, right? So don't fall victim to it. Don't give in. Don't give in. Be careful. That's all you can be in this life, is very careful. Yet this so frequently happens where people satisfy themselves with such an experience and only partially get to the bottom of the matter. Oh yeah, I saw that. And that's it. That's good enough for them. But they don't go deeper and deeper. They want the truth in that particular matter, but are they willing to universally apply this to all things and realize the full extent of assumptions across the board? That's a whole different matter. It's a whole different type of person, right? Most of these will stop short of that, as they too have personal agendas in their lives and are not willing to be absolutely honest at all times in all things. I mean, that's not even believed to be possible, which is, again, one of the great universal lies spread, is that we cannot be honest, that we are all in deceit all the time. Well, that's a pretty self-defeating statement, I would say. Is that true? But that's the mentality, is that, and that's where the skepticism sneaks in too, that we cannot know, we cannot be, blah, blah, blah. Says who? I mean, certainly God in the Bible doesn't say that we cannot be that. We're exhorted to be such that. Anyway, as long as people get what they want, right, what they want, They will only confront prejudice and assumptions for that purpose. Right? That's the purpose. It's not for the truth itself. Don't kid yourself. You know it's true that people, for the most part, are not, unless it's just a mere curiosity, if it's for a benefit, you know. And in truth, all truth does benefit those who love the truth, right? But mostly people only challenge assumptions when it benefits them. Who of you will dare to make this universal? So before we look more specifically at the essence of assumptions and what to do otherwise, let us look at two major categories in life which you possibly can identify with. So assumptions can be devastating to our bodies and our health. So countless examples can be found in the history of the world and even in recent history where we all can now agree that various serious evils resulted from assumptions made by the general public. Right? So I've studied the history of science and the history of religion, history of philosophy, and history of medicine, and all sorts of different histories. And there are so many examples of where the general public has been very deceived about one or more matters. And it's a fascination with me. It's more than a fascination. It is a major research agenda for me to find the examples where masses have been deceived, because I care about our present day. I care about the future, and I want people to avoid doing that, overcome those prejudices and so forth. And I find it fascinating that all the examples, and I would like to compile a whole list of them. Now I've started to do that going back way in history when we found Noah and the ark, and obviously the whole world was wrong beside Noah and his family. And whether you believe that's a true story or not, you can walk with me a little bit where you can understand where masses of people have been wrong. Now it's interesting when you try and do a search for that kind of idea on the internet, you cannot find easily such examples, except for those really corny 10 times, 10 ways in which this has happened. And they're always really shoddy research and very, not always the best examples. But where do you find, when you type in a search engine nowadays, in the last 10 years, everything has changed, become commercially oriented. It was like the internet was first a kind of like to draw you in, and then like YouTube, for example, first gave you a lot of money for the advertisements, and now gives you nothing, really. You can't make a living off of videos. I certainly don't make anything for these videos. So anyway, but search engines, especially Google, which is obviously the same as YouTube, when you search for all the important things in life, you rarely find what you're looking for. And it's very hard. You have to go deep within, maybe even hundreds of pages before you find the relevant information you're looking for, unless it's a commercial product. And even then, so it's showing you that it's controlled, because it didn't used to be that way. I've been on the internet since when it first became popular, at least, or accessible to the general public, and I've watched how it's changed so much more recently. And so when you try and find that example, you can hardly find it. I mean, unless you can correct me wrong, because I would like to compile this, because it's very important. And what I'm going to have to say here relates to the technology I'm dealing with, because a lot of the things that I'm doing goes back to this time period that I'm going to refer to, where there was a lot of things that people believed that weren't true. And masses of people were deceived at the time. So some people could say, well, what you believe, Rick, is of that nature too. It's all a hoax, it's all a lie, or it's a mistake, or whatever. And I'm here to say, no, it's not. I can demonstrate that, and you can demonstrate it to yourself, more importantly, that there is these processes, and I've shown in various ways, and I'll continue to show it. Even in this video, I want to talk about it and explain to you why, in different ways, how you can see it. But what I want to point out is the opposite of that. The only reason I mentioned that was because people are going to try and categorize that as is of the same nature, a deception, an assumption, an overly optimistic hope, whatever. But I have here two examples, and one of them is not actually, it's a little bit earlier than that time period, but for thousands of years, so even going back thousands of years, this was believed. People believed in bloodletting because of what they assumed about the body and illness. And so this became a practice, and they removed large amounts of blood in the hope that it would reduce or end the illness. Now, in some cases, a buildup of blood, like in a bruise, there's a buildup of blood and you need to release it, drain it. But this is not bloodletting I'm referring to, of course. The first U.S. president, George Washington, died just prior to him experiencing this common practice. It's not my object to get into those details or say that he was murdered or something like that. It's not at all what I'm trying to say. But it's only to show that it was accepted at the highest levels until doctors like Dr. Isaac Jennings of Oberlin College, who gave us the placebo pill idea, exposed this great mistake of that practice. And Isaac Jennings, who was the founding doctor at Oberlin College, where they had the lowest sickness rate, even though they were considered on the far west at the time, in miserable conditions in Ohio there. But anyway, Isaac Jennings practiced this placebo effect as well, and many other things that we today recognize as very sound principle or practices. He was a vegetarian though, so if that upsets you, I want to speak the truth there. I'm not a vegetarian, but I understood his ideas. But the point is, he practiced this placebo effect and had great success. And when people found out, some people were very upset with him. And so, even though it worked in a sense, because people had the ability to heal themselves when they were optimistic, their hope alone cured them. It wasn't a particular substance that was curing them. And the body, as he was showing, had great ability to heal itself. And that's what he was trying to promote, setting the conditions for the body to heal itself, rather than seeking synthetic and artificial means to do that. Getting your environment right, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. So anyway, my point was that it was based upon assumptions, as bloodletting, right? Based upon assumptions, it was no doubt argued for in a very persuasive way, and became an accepted method of treatment. It was well accepted. And who would be peasant to challenge that, No doubt, people were desperate to try anything, and desperate times lead people to do desperate things. But at the time, it was considered sound by the leading experts. So it's not as, I mean, it's serious because it had serious repercussions in people's life, their health, and dying of it. But I want to get into another example that's more disturbing and far more extensive than I can cover here. And this overlaps the time period of technology that I'm dealing with for a large part now. So it is the use of questionable remedies for illnesses or substances endorsed for any undesired state of being. So we probably all heard of these stories. We look back and shake our head, right? So we can all agree that 130 years ago, the general population was very mistaken about many remedies of the day. Now there are always voices like these Isaac Jennings warning people of this, but how many people care to pay attention, right? So what was the reason they were mistaken, though, more importantly? Let's look at an example. Children's soothing syrups were used to help parents with their children in all sorts of ways. What was in their ingredients? And the many other ingredients of many of these other remedies. They were comprised of many narcotics, such as large amounts of pure morphine and cocaine and all sorts of poisons. Today it's easy to see their great error because the herd think tank has educated people into classifying such substances as not only not good for the public to have, which is not good for the public to have, I should say, while they are not consistently classifying other equally harmful substances. So today we've been educated to know these things are bad, but hypocritically we're not classifying equally dangerous substances as equally bad. And so we are easily pointing the finger again at somebody else. So the general public today just shakes their head when they read about such practices. Can you believe that? Wow. But the practice continues today just the same as back then. Only now it is heavily regulated. And that's the key. They're heavily regulated. In both times, dangerous substances produce great profits, so we can see the truth takes the back seat, and justification for such products are based upon extreme examples of confirmation bias, where companies take great pains to justify their claims. The truth. Is it about the truth? It's always acted like the truth is important, but it's just used as a gimmick, self-justification. With the whole pharmaceutical industry, you see this rampant confirmation bias, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So how were people then, and you and I now, to relate to such claims and products? Where lies the problem? What is the real problem? Is it in the products themselves, in their claims, or is it in us? Are we not to blame? It's in assumptions. The company's making assumptions, and the people who are buying it. In these cases, it is the assumptions of the masses which makes them powerfully persuasive. Right? That the whole masses of people adopt something is very powerful. Nevertheless, we can all agree that it was the mere assumptions that were the reason for the adoption of such practices. The mere assumptions are the basis. The truth was not different then from today. The physical world did not change to make it true now for us. It wasn't like, oh, back then cocaine was not harmful to people, but suddenly maybe it genetically modified, now it's becoming a dangerous thing, right? No, it always was, and people knew it, and they didn't care because it was new. What's new is true, and old is mold, right? And it was a day where so many things were new. There were so many new inventions. This was the new modern age. And whatever we discovered has to be true. It was this idealism that was there, to the point where people thought the end of the world was coming, the millennium was going to be coming, says Miller in 1844. And the realist, like Charles Finney, convinced them that it wasn't going to be. But nevertheless, there was such optimism, and people were just believing, and it was so easy for these manipulators to take advantage of that spirit and deceive people. So it wasn't, too much optimism is immoral. And that's a hard thing to say, and it really takes some clarification, I guess, to say what I mean there. But when it becomes assumption without basis, then it is immoral. To make a leap into the unknown without sufficient reason, good and sufficient reason. So there's a difference between assumption and a mistake. I want to clarify that. We can honestly make a mistake or be misled with deception. While these are similar ideas, the focus of this video is on choices that are made that should not have been made, and which imply bad character or wrongdoing. And that's where you have to make a proper distinction in your life. Some people overblame themselves and don't forgive themselves or whatever, they can't move on. And some people justify their actions that were immoral and wrong as merely mistakes. And often people will do that, they'll say, it was a mistake, their sins. Well, surely their sin was a mistake, but it was a sin as a crime, right? And there's a difference. So for me, it's important to make fine distinctions like that, because just blurring things doesn't help, right? There are many things that people can do innocently that are mistakes, and that are not the same thing. However, one of my goals in this is to show how people have generally adopted the prejudice or assumption principle in their lives as a sort of filtering of reality, right? Filtering of reality, which is the cardinal sin, right? This is the real essence of sin. While they may make many innocent mistakes, even these people that are guilty, they may make many innocent mistakes, right? As we all do in this life. We have to come to grips with that. We all make mistakes, many mistakes. The choice to allow assumptions to foster and reign supreme, on the other hand, implies a life of absolute deceit at a fundamental level. And that has to be grasped above all things here. People want to see, I only want to think about a few people in history that are at that level. That they are fundamentally deceived. Their lives are completely, absolutely deception. In other words, their motivation is in a state of deception. Once you adopt that principle, you continue to adopt it until you repent or change your heart, change your attitude, change your procedure. And you will not only continue to make individual acts of assumptions, biases, but you'll continue to hold on to the ones that started the whole thing. And your whole life will be a chain of these lies leading to other lies. And a big mess, and a big web of deception. That's what I mean. It's a whole, complete, absolute deceit at a fundamental level. The deceit might not be noticed by others, or may even be consistent with the prevailing practices and popular opinion. You can fit right in. So, someone gave me a book to read called The People of the Lie. And this is from 1985 by a psychologist who was talking about how there are people who are evil, as he calls them, different than other people in life. And these people are really beyond hope, what he was saying, in essence. They were people who know that they're being fundamentally deceitful, and they're willing to disregard other people or harm other people with really no manifest conscience about it. And they're not really wrestling with doing good and bad anymore. Everything is purposely to gratify their ends. Right now, I disagree with the premise of the book, that the radical distinction the guy was making in saying that people are only evil if they get to that level. I think that's more of a hopeless state. That's where, people have seared their conscience permanently, and generally are gone, morally speaking. Not outwardly, though. Outwardly, they have a show of morality most of the time. And that's what he's showing in this book. The truthful part of this book is that he brings out that these people are not the ones that you find in prison, he says. He says you'll find very few of these in prison, which, again, I would disagree with that. But he says they're in everywhere. Everywhere you go, there are these really good people all around you, that they're in your churches, and they're in your, there are these people that are these great examples for us to follow, supposedly. And yet, here they are. When you actually get down to it, morally speaking, they're very deceitful at the core. And so, like I said, they are based upon, but I say it goes further than just those people. In fact, everyone who's bad is evil. The same word means the same thing, evil and bad. Today, it means in English, common usage, evil is a greater degree of bad. But biblically speaking, bad and evil are the same sort of thing. You're either good or bad, one or the other. You're not more good, less good. You're either good or bad. And here, it's very important to realize that you're either assuming things or not. And that's what's going to come down to in this whole... you're either in a state of deception where you're holding the truth in the state of deception, or you're walking in conformity to all the known truth that you have. So in this, I'm making a very important distinction between judging people by their particular outward actions and views, as opposed to judging based upon why and how they decide to do anything in particular. So the difference is that people who are, people do actions, as I said before, because of the motivations of their heart, right? But people in society tend to judge people as if the way their outward actions are determine their character. In other words, the results. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So, for the nature of their true character is found in some belief they have or outward action. But the reason they have, for the nature of their true character is not found in some belief they have or outward action, but the reason they have for the action, their motive, and the honesty they have in that motive. Like you can have proximate motives. So for example, two people can work to save money, they work together, the two side by side. Let's look at these two people. So in all ways they appear identical. They work to make money, to get an education, to be prepared to do a particular work, to all the same. And one is to have money or fame, reputation, for doing that great good work. And the other one is for the good of the people and the glory of God. And so you can have proximate motives that are the same. I can have a motive to do this, to get that. But what's my ultimate end? What's my ultimate motive? And that's where these particular evil people, according to Peck in that book, are ones that are doing it for their own selfish agenda, or as I'm saying, that people do it, they can look, as the book said, as I said, they can look like they're good people because they're doing all these things that appear normal and good, and they're friendly and what have you, but ultimately they did it for another reason all along. They were always, the back of their mind, the reason for their motives was for some selfish gain. And in the process of doing that, it wasn't just some, little thought and there's no real consequences besides that final moment. There's a whole lifestyle difference, of course, internally with the person, the two different types of people. But in the course of doing that, they're going to be making all sorts of assumptions at the same time in the life of such individuals. And so, for example, so this man, gets up from his bed one day and he puts on his clothes and he shaves, he showers, and he eats breakfast and makes phone calls to take care of matters, and he goes down out of his apartment into his parking lot, and while he's going into the parking lot, he opens the door for this old lady, and it kind of, it seemed polite, and he goes and he obeys all the traffic laws, going to the bank, and the bank, he waits in line for his turn, and when it becomes his turn, he like points a gun at the teller and gets the money, right? And so everything up until that point was normal and would be considered good, right? But really, what was his intention? To steal the money. But what was his intention? Just to steal the money? Or was there a reason to steal the money? What does he get out of the money? There's another intention, a deeper motive. And what is the ultimate motive? Self-gain, self-interest. And, it's a delusion, but how somebody can satisfy themselves under those circumstances, I don't know. But the point is, I'm trying to bring out the idea of the deepest motives of the heart. He's living for himself. He's blinded himself to the nature of the value of the individual people he's harmed, to the kingdom of God, the faith of the community. All these things have been harmed by his actions. He could care less. He's blinded himself to that and deceived himself. It's an assumption, and many assumptions he probably made before he came to that place of such depravity. Anyway, so again, more importantly, their ultimate end for doing anything. Everyone believes this and so judges others of what I'm saying today. Yet, when social norms make practices acceptable, people ignore people's foundational motives. When something is acceptable, even though it shouldn't be, people don't question it. They don't examine people's motives for doing it because, hey, we got a free ticket here. Everybody's doing it, Mom. What's the big deal? Who are you to challenge it? Is implied in that question or statement. Assumptions, prejudice, and bias are tolerated when unhealthy and immoral practices are popular, or when people discovered to be such are demonstrating such in matters that are not seen to have been serious consequences on others or society. So in other words, there's kind of a wordy sentence there. When they're accepted, when it doesn't seem to be that serious. The consequences aren't that serious, so therefore nobody's integrity is in question. So you go, for example, all these churches today where there's all these loose morals and pretty much anything goes in so many churches. And so if people are engaging in more socially acceptable sins, they're not really challenged, right? They're struggling, they're whatever. But if they have certain particular sins that are not socially acceptable, which is becoming few and far between now, because pretty much anything goes, then they're grilled. How dare you? How could you do that? How? But really, essentially, what's the difference in the spirit of things, right? And this is kind of what happened in a lot of more recent issues in my lifetime, watching the state of the regular churches, whatever you want to call them, where certain things that were deemed very wrong, what happened was that whole argument actually gained substance, where people realize what's the difference between one sin and another. And so instead of moving in the right direction and saying, yeah, we need to actually address any deceit, any form of assumptions, or any kind of bad behavior, they just said, well, we can't judge anything because we're all in this predicament. And so then, bit by bit, more and more things became incorporated and allowed until there's really nothing left. Just a sort of a social gathering it's become. So, when this becomes the case, laws, enforcement of laws, and the penalties for laws broken, this is what accounts for why these things have so widely varied throughout history and cultures. Because people have allowed what is popular to become acceptable. But usually there's always something to fixate on. There's always some evil. There has to be some Bin Laden behind every corner, right? Even though if they're dead for years, we still gotta be seeing them. Like Hitler is still alive after all these years. It's ridiculous. There always has to be a boogeyman. There always has to be somebody to put to the stake in hypocrisy. Not that there isn't really, really bad people that, have done these things. The point is, there's a contradiction. And this is where you get a lot of people pointing out, well, how can you have such strong laws here and none here? It's not consistent. And so it's very complicated to work out. I'm not denying that. But we see hypocrisy all the time in this, as shown throughout history, and that's how you account for it. because people are willing to justify the same spirit and character of certain vices, but then decide these ones we're not going to. And the criminal who's just an outlaw or whatever type, who doesn't really care about anyone in society, and he just could care less, he looks at that and says, well, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. And if that's the case, then I don't feel any guilt for what I'm doing. That's what they'll do. That's the reasoning. And I watched that as a youth. I saw the mindset, that mindset, so I know. Anyway, everyone deals with assumptions all the time, but few people dare to oppose the substance itself for its own sake and all that it harms. Who wants to be universal? We see people make radical distinctions between assumptions, as if the practice of engaging them in one way is innocent or relatively innocent, while the other ways are life-threatening or immoral. So they make this distinction as if some assumptions are worse than others. Well, they're not. It's a confusion of a category mistake. It's like a category mistake to say that it's a different, that they're different things. They are the same category, and it's trying to make them into two different categories. Well, there isn't a difference. Assumptions are assumptions, and to jump into belief of something that you ought not to, no matter what the consequence is immorality in itself. It is wrong. So what basis is there for this? There is none. It is only done because people tend to judge action mostly by the immediate results coming from some such action, and not from the ultimate motive behind the choices made, to assume that which was wrong. And that's the key. They look for the outward result, as I said. They judge by, oh, that good man, he opened the door for me. Bless his heart, right? Well, it's good that you didn't judge him as bad because of the opening of the door, but he wasn't a bad man. He's on the way to the bank, to rob the bank. And, so on the other side, now some scenarios will be, somebody will do something and it will appear to be bad, but it was actually for good. And there's a lot of mistakes people could make in that regard. So it's based upon the motive of such action. And then, like I said, what was the quality of that motive, right? If the motive was merely a proximate end, was it, and not the ultimate end, what was the quality, what was the reason for that motive? Was it a good motive or a bad motive? And again, if it had assumptions in it, it's not good automatically. People will judge the murderer for their intent on killing a person. So what was evil in that? In that case, a person dying is a serious thing. But what was the core methodology of the murderer behind the action? That person had to adopt the assuming principle and block out much truth throughout the whole process. It wasn't just the result, but the dishonesty of heart and the resolute adherence to that choice of action. Right? We've talked about. So the choice to get what you want in the situation and in their entire life. So the court looks at such things to determine the guilt. What makes murder different from manslaughter or different degrees of murder? Is it merely the outward action, or the result that determines the guilt or degree of evil. In fact, people can't even, without motive, it's very hard to impute crime. Right? It is the choice to select our own reality and so make assumptions that leads to every evil. When it is always known that jumping into the unknown is reckless, dangerous, and immoral. So that's what I've been saying about Tesla as my chief concern about his influence in this world. While I say a lot of good things about Tesla, I am very much opposed to a lot of what he did and his practice in that regards. He ended up diving into the unknown and thrusting the world into the unknown. And he was a very influential person, so he ought to have been more careful. And so the idea of recklessness to jump right into the unknown, like for example, promoting X-rays without doing proper investigation. And again, the idea behind it was good to self. If I see, it's pragmatism. Pragmatism is a ruthless philosophy that doesn't care about anybody else but the particular thing at hand, and it's taking things out of the context of the greatest good and the good of the future, for example, and says if it works, use it. And that's exactly what Tesla was, a very typical pragmatist. And that itself is reckless. So it is the job of a parent to train their children against doing that. They teach them not to assume the worst against their siblings, but to be fair and to treat others as they would wish to be treated. And yet many parents encourage their children to do or believe whatever they want to in the way of assuming whatever you wish. All the entertainment, the schools, and everything is constantly feeding that whole, you need to be gratified, stimulated. The kids are bored now, they're so overly stimulated because they have been completely bred into this self-interest. But the world can't sustain such a practice. It cannot but create chaos, as self-interest and blind prejudice automatically contradicts the welfare of others. I mean, we've all seen the spoiled brat, right? Who creates chaos, and his parents are wrapped around his finger, right? Or her finger. And it's just a nightmare when you look at the absolute misery of everybody in light of this. I mean, what is this child going to become? So it doesn't work because two selfish individuals cannot exercise everything that they want to exercise. There has to be something greater than self-interest, right? Now people lay down they compromise to some degree to cohabitate under that, but the point is, the principle itself cannot work. Naturally, in our day, we see the working out of this practice in philosophy, and as that becomes more and more adopted and prevalent and acceptable philosophy, everything goes down the tubes. Nobody cares about anything in the end. Self-destruction. Now, such people only judge other people for assuming certain things when they disagree with their conclusions. This can also be seen the opposite way. You see people gladly support a person who promotes their cause or issue, even when they know the foundation of the support was based upon unfounded assumptions. So both negatively and positively, another way you look at it, they're going to disagree with others because of their conclusions, and point out their fallacies and errors and assumptions. But when it comes to my camp, I'm not going to point it out to my friend. So I'm not going to treat my friend like my enemy. Well, I do. So I wouldn't have any friends. They wouldn't be real friends if I didn't honestly point out their faults, right? And I wouldn't count somebody a friend who wouldn't do that for me. But they will readily confront others they differ in conclusions or issue and expose their assumptions. So, that's what I said, yeah. So you see this in party politics, rival groups, and everywhere in life. It's hypocrisy and reveals that everyone knows assumptions are wrong and immoral. They know it, you can see it by them being able to point it out in others. So they do see it all the time. It's just when they're willing to look for it and when they're not. It's confirmation bias again. The practice itself is wrong, but people usually only call it wrong if it goes against their desires. And this proves that generally people's morality is essentially selfish, where self-interest is the real foundation of their estimation of right and wrong. So you find so many people say people are generally good, but really the opposite is true. People are generally bad. It's just that they have appearance of goodness and they go along with it. They go along with the social norms, both good and bad policy, because it's the norm, not because if it's good or bad. But following the herd is itself immoral when you ought to question the herd, right? So this is why it is so hard for people to be fair judges of people's character when they differ with them on various issues. They're so committed in prejudice, positively and negatively, like I said, that they're not fair either way, right? Only once in a while you see somebody who's removed themselves from that mentality. People do not want to deal with their own assumptions and prejudgments. Anyone exposing that practice is a threat to them. And that's, again, the foundational reason for so much persecution. People all across the world will unite on people with differing beliefs and everything will unite in attacking somebody who dares contradict the foundational principle that I'm talking about, this prejudice assumption principle. And so those who have the power over others will generally try to crush them before they get exposed. They know if this person talks enough, preaches enough, people will start becoming aware of moral obligations and that we need to be people of integrity, and then they will find their little secrets out, just like we're finding now with all these people after all these years who have been doing these things to these women or men. And the question is, why now? That's the big question I have. Why does it come out now? Because there always seems to be somebody in the limelight getting attacked, and so whatever happened, they just made this decision now to bring this all out. But generally, anyone who is of a true character is considered a threat, who is willing to walk in the truth, because that in itself exposes other people to becoming caught. So they want to attack them. They're considered a threat. And it's just natural. Like, so I was with somebody, and, well, no, I'll say this. I watched as somebody adopted a new lifestyle change for the better, right? And their whole family was involved in that, and they were very gentle about it. But you could see how others felt threatened, even without them saying any words. They felt like they might have been being judged by them, just merely they were feeling insecure because it threatened them. Even though the person was very quiet about it or anything, it wasn't doing anything offensive in any way or being judgmental at all. And so that's what can happen to people merely by living a certain way. They will be perceived as a threat, and threats are attacked or removed. And thus, the whole world has experienced persecution continuously. So the same is true in the scientific world. Let's take a step back and consider research and acceptable knowledge and possibilities. We are all born into a world of cause and effect relationships and constantly make decisions based upon such. Some people are aware of that and work specifically with physical objects and processes for various reasons. In each area of study and occupation, there are long established norms and understandings. They're not easily changed. The educational institutions strongly push their established theories and give little opportunity to question the foundation or particulars. Students are essentially trained to memorize answers and solve problems within a given model or framework in a nice, tidy box that works for the goal of such education. They are not taught to reason or to value moral integrity above personal ambition. So that's a key statement there. I remember having the opportunity to speak to 2,000 students in the open square of the university. It was a fascinating opportunity to have everyone's attention under a certain circumstance. And I got up and I spoke to them, and I took advantage of asking them certain questions, because I went around about 12 years ago to all these campuses across the United States. And I asked them the questions like this. These things that I'm talking about are based upon years of investigation and reading and research and thousands of conversations. And in that case, I asked them, how many of you have studied logic? And we're talking about kids that are, anywhere from 18 to, early 20s, right? At the end of their education. And I'm asking them, how many of you study logic? And they're all paying attention, right? They're all facing me. They're not just talking. They're engrossed in what I have to say for some particular reason, which is not important. And I asked them these questions. Only a few hands went up. And I said, when did you start? And then they would, there's literally only a few hands out of everybody. And they would say, just this year. And probably none of them had started from the very beginning. And then I would ask them other questions, of course, about the moral side of their education too. But isn't it interesting that we go through 12 years of education or more and get to that state, and this was one of the leading universities in the country, I won't mention which one, but these guys had gone through 12 years and had not been taught how to think or how to question things properly, the nature of things, like basic philosophy, but logic. They had no reasoning skills, abilities. Now they had been taught mathematics, which is very similar. It's the same faculty of the mind that deals with the reasoning faculty. So very similar to logic, right? It is a form of logic, but they did not understand fallacies, informal fallacies, syllogisms properly, all this stuff. So they didn't understand the ability, they didn't have the ability to evaluate what they were being told all those years. And this is alarming. The very nature of the university, the center of study, like in Plato's idea was morality and reason, right? Virtue, ethics was most important, right? Whether they were consistent with that is another point, but it was the focus. To be virtuous and to be reasonable, was the highest priorities. Now those are not important at all. Replication, pragmatism, usefulness to the groupthink, whatever, memorization, replication of what's being told, machine, like a machine. You are made into being a machine through the school systems today. Not necessarily everybody, but generally speaking. And there is no ethics in that, besides what some teacher can whisper in your ear, because you can't even bring a Bible to school or something like that. You can be taught comparative religion in that, but there's no sense of ethics. The ethics is do as thou wilt, right? And it's amazing to me why the schools aren't completely in chaos when you think, how do they even control these kids anymore? Because it breeds no respect. There is no more respect anymore for adults and authorities and what have you. And so the point is, it's all the opposite now. No sense of finding out the nature of things other than what we're told from the top down. So they're taught to memorize and repeat what they're shown. There's little opportunity to question anything and prove upon anything, as I said, as if they will either succeed or no. And if they do, they will either succeed in amazing everybody with some great idea and be considered genius, or more likely be considered a rebel for not just going along with the program. So, yeah, like they would be a genius because if they're not taught how to think and they come up with a good idea, that's like inconsistent because they're not taught to think. They're not taught to come up with good ideas. They're taught to exist in the box and be a machine, handing on, passing, automated. Just like Tesla said, we're all just a machine. Whatever comes to us, we regurgitate out. That's not true. So when somebody comes along who doesn't fit with it, they don't think the same way, then what happens, they can become a genius because what happens is they struggle because they're not the same as everybody else. So then they struggle in that, which forces them to think things differently, different patterns, different And then they start to see other things that nobody's looking at because they're looking at it from a different angle. And then they're either stereotyped as some stupid kid, right? Or they're a rebel, or both. Because, or some slight case, they stumble upon something that is being able to be useful, so then they're considered genius, right? And, whatever. But in most cases, the person who's different, who thinks differently, who even questions things, is a problematic rebel. Put them on medication, right? Get them in line. Overactive imagination, young man, young woman. In that context, they may get a job, right? Talking about the one who's gone through the motions now. They may get a job someday that pays for research to be done. They may be free to explore other theories now and facts, but they may be limited by new forces, such as those pertaining to money and reputation. Oh, I thought I was free, but I'm even worse state now. Maybe they are paid to find anything that proves that their product is good for the body, and to ignore anything that would show it is harmful. Now, I was going to write some examples in here, and I thought that would detract from the point, but this happens many, many times. It's a subject for another video, but the point is, the idea of this, the experience of this is very common. So in the course of their research, they cannot help but discover the latter. And now they have to decide what they are going to do with this information that the product is actually harmful. Maybe they found it out merely out of curiosity, while others made the choice to commit confirmation bias and not look in such directions. They won't even go there. They don't care. They're getting paid to do whatever. At the end of the day, I don't take my job home. I don't really care. It just pays the bills, right? So at some point, these guys, along the line, these guys and gals made a choice to just assume one or many things, and or they decided to suppress what they already know. Suppression of truth and assumption of the truth are of the same spirit and character, and are really the same thing. And they happen at the same time anyway. I could make careful distinctions, but they're essentially the same thing. It happened at the same time, part of the same motivation and will, action. So this person is working for this company, has to decide what they are going to do. They already decided in taking the job that they would work under the condition of confirmation bias. But now what are they going to do? And this may be where you are right now. Is that the case? You are in debt. You have a family and need to support them. You need this job. What's the harm in doing that? And thus the snare in society today. There's so many traps and compromises that keep people morally compromised and underestimating the evil of assumptions. They get trapped in a deeper and deeper web. And that financial trap is a huge thing. It's a huge motivator. And it entangles people. And then they get overwhelmed, morally compromised, and they can never even imagine forgiving themselves, or what have you at times. Different motivations, all the same kind of character, based upon a life of assumptions, a life of entanglements. So when we consider the subject of energy now, energy production and efficiency, the same problems exist. We have long established teachings and practices that make it difficult to overcome error. People daring to challenge that will suffer in various ways. And I've seen this in history, I've seen it close up, where people people have lost their jobs, lost their reputations, and a lot more serious things have happened to them who have dared to challenge things. And so there's a way to do it and there's a way not to do it. There's a way that is allowable and there's a way that it's not. So the acceptable systems are largely based upon maximum profits for various interests. There's a lot of money to be made within that system, so that as long as you work within it, you have the ability to prosper. So if you want to become an energy company where you sell energy, they don't care how you make it, right? As long as it doesn't bother. Like you can even violate the established teachings, so long as it doesn't disrupt the regular flow. So as long as people go about with really no change to the existing systems, it doesn't matter, because the profit base is not disturbed. The prejudice base is secured, you know, but go and threaten that, and then you have automatic persecution, automatic suppression and attack. In fact, thousands of patents have been granted that clearly violate conventional teachings. Thousands. So, for example, well, I'll talk about it in a minute. And that's over the last 100 years. Now, I brought out some of the first patents that actually show stated over unity processes, and they work too. But you won't find a patent that specifically declares that today. In fact, anybody who's tried more recently has not gotten a patent. So they would have to disguise those claims within their, you know, so products have actually been made upon such patents for generations. So long as people are not aware of the contradictions and the oil continues to flow, such is acceptable. So people in the Western world have pretty much, over the last 100 years, had one or more products that contain processes that produce more energy out than what is put into them. And this is acceptable. It's acceptable to have the patents for them, as long as the patent and the process is for a different purpose that is acceptable and that doesn't contradict the profits, and also doesn't contradict the whole idea of what do you call it? I'm lost for words now. Of the long-term profit. I'll stop where I don't want to stumble anymore on that. But anyway, the idea of allowing you to I forgot it. It's getting late. Anyway, so such products are made for certain purposes, such as producing specific forms of light or sound or what have you. So they were not made to demonstrate a violation of the core teaching, even though they do demonstrate that, and they do not draw attention to such. So these products are allowed, have been allowed, and some of them have been quietly discontinued because somebody maybe drew attention to them, and so they were cut. And there's a lot of new technologies that are making it more and more difficult to do these processes, and regulations and so forth. So they were not made for the direct purpose of energy manipulation, even though they could be used for such. It's all hush-hush. So, they were made to produce given effects, certain amounts of light for certain particular purposes, certain particular equipment, not necessarily widely used. Obviously the whole warfare machine classifies things so you don't even know what's going on there. I'm not even getting into that. But you have products that have existed in processes. And if you were to really focus in on them, you would see what's happening. You'd be able to multiply it out and be amazed at that. And I have brought some attention to that in some ways over time. So one of the ways to effectively accomplish the immortalization of the teaching is to actually mention the contrary processes such as negative resistance or sympathetic resonance and so many others in passing. So you just give them lip service. You pass over them, but you don't emphasize them, and you leave people up to their own prejudices, their own assumptions. So what kind of assumption would you make if you go through a course of electrical engineering, get a whole degree in it, and only have a very brief description of some of these processes that would contradict Ohm's law, for example, or what have you? And what would that do? The rushed student doesn't have time to question anything, but merely to repeat what he has been told in the test, while effectively be convinced that he has been taught on the subject thoroughly, so that down the road, if someone brings up the key words, they will say that they already know about it. Because the professor merely passes over these nonlinear processes, the student feels that they are not important or a mere occasional or accidental phenomena under very rare circumstances. What is stressed must be practical. So if it's not stressed, it must not be important, must not be easy or repeatable. It must be an exception, or and that's the automatic assumption that somebody would make, because the presumption is you go to school because you have authorities who have thoroughly studied the subject, and you go to them with your questions because they're the ones who studied it out. So if they teach on a course and fail to tell you something important, you would not expect that. You expect them to tell you all that is pertinent and important to that subject. So when they don't emphasize something, they pass it along, you automatically assume, or should you? The people just do assume that it's not important. And I know, because I talk to countless engineers all over the world who tell me the same story, both who are skeptical and believing of these over-unity processes. So that is their story as told to me and others, and that's the reality. And if you go and look at the textbooks, you find there's one little paragraph or whatever. But the truth is that these little paragraphs are really, I was going to say half of the existing processes. But really they should be almost all of the existing processes, because we are doing everything in a sense backwards electronically than what we could be doing and even should be. In the biological world, it isn't as we are doing it. And I'm not competent to speak enough about that to use all the right wording, but we are not using the processes that are found in God's creation. What we're doing is like what we do in so many other things in life, we mess it up. We do it synthetically, wrong way, when God has already provided a better way for us. So what we are doing in that way is for maximum profits. It's for a simple system that does work. Remember pragmatism? Pragmatism, again, is a open-ended philosophy that allows for the manipulation of people over others because it works, right? What works, and it's repeatable, and it's profitable. So it works for profit, and it works because it's predictable. The other way is very open-ended, and it is, both ways are potentially dangerous, but they are both potentially dangerous. But the natural energy flows are far more healthy, and the present forms of energy that we use are actually unhealthy for us. And that is another aspect of this that is a very big concern. And that's another subject matter, of course. So, the education, the biases there, the ways of suppressing it through the education, and then you have all these people that have gone through these courses, and then they become the spokespersons to defend the faith. They don't go on necessarily to any advanced levels of physics and that, and where people become aware of these things more readily. And then what happens is these spokespersons are the effective means of silencing any opposition, and then whatever. But my question is, like I said before, is how come people, like I brought out this video series, you know, the first free energy patent misunderstood, some time back, and I asked the question, why is it that hardly anybody has drawn attention to these various patents and their claims? At the time, those patents were demonstrated when they were presented. And they're actually fairly easy to replicate. So why is it that people have been replicating? Now, I did replicate some of them in some videos, and they're fairly easy to do. So why is it that people are so fixated on these more recent claims and individuals that are really only building upon these earlier patents and individuals? So why don't they get the attention? Because they actually work. And there is a very interesting silence that I keep questioning people on. Why is that silence there? And the people who are sincere are asking the same questions, and they're saying, well, what's going on there? You know, the point is, it's a matter of fact that you can look up these patents and see them right on Google Patents, like Benitez, Carlos F. Benitez. Now, this was an American patent. He did even have some American patents, but these were British patents. And so why is it that nobody has ever attempted a challenge against that? Because you can't. Because it's very easy to replicate. And so don't draw any attention to it, because then people will see it. But why in the so-called free energy community is that not a big priority or focus? Why? It's a very interesting question, which I won't assume the answer to. So now, in the same way, medical training, in medical training, so little time is given to prevention and positive nutrition that doctors have little education and ability to help others with positive health, and are merely focused on dealing with the negative side of things. Like I said, Jennings, way before, 100 and, what, how many years now? 180 years ago, it's a long time, was already bringing out things that are sound principles today on, having the body more heal itself and setting, having more positive environment so that you can do that. But why is it that the students are not taught more positive things? The student is rushed under pressure and lives in an unnatural environment. There is little time to evaluate if what they are taught is accurate or sound. Yet there are some who question things. But what are they questioning? The assumptions, because the contradictions they have seen. So it's a big subject, the whole medical world, and it's one of the biggest profit industries in our day, and so it's a big circle, and it just spirals more and more out of control. And natural methods are avoided, it's suppressed, and people are considered dangerous to themselves if they don't partake in the system. Even someone was mentioning the other day, somebody who went to another hospital to get another opinion was, many people have been in that predicament and suffered loss to the point of losing their child or the child dying or what have you, because there's such a clampdown on the way of doing things, and people will have to go to other countries to get certain treatment, which can be risky and what have you. So again, all these assumptions, all this tight control, profit-based, and you can't question anything, right? It's so elaborate. It's so impressive, really. Like, how can you question it? It's been around. This institution has been around for 2,000 years. Therefore, I know it's got to be true. And that's another whole subject I'm not going to get into. But the point is, one lie can lead to another, building up. And I'm not saying every doctor is engaged in lying. And I don't know. I don't know doctors personally. And I know that obviously some are trying to do what they can within that context. And, whether they are compromised or not, they'll know the answer to that. But the point is, it's a very complex matter. There's a lot of lines that can easily be crossed in trying to go down that road. And I can imagine how difficult it would be. So this brings us to the opposite alternative, to making assumptions. And what is that? How can you avoid doing that? Is it even possible to not make assumptions? Or are we all just condemned to assume things? Can we have any choice in the matter? Many assume that is the case and say it is fine as long as it doesn't go too far. They would say the same thing about lying. Lie when it is needed. Oops. Needed for who? When? Who's the judge of when it is right to lie or assume? So really, that's again that distinction between serious assumptions, serious lies, and ones that don't have serious consequences. But I ask the question, is not the truth itself sacred? Isn't it sacred? What is it about any action that determines its rightness or wrongness? Morally, there only two different states of being for conscious people. Two. People want to make various grades, levels of good and bad people. But really there's only two. There's only really two. There might be more than two bad types of people in the sense that one may be hopelessly committed and others not there yet. But there's two essential characters in life at any particular time in one's life. There are those who set up their own desires and their good as the highest priority and partake in assumptions and confirmation bias to make that happen. Right? Those are the tools that they work with. That is the means that make them that way. The motive is for self-good, right? And self-good isn't wrong in itself, but when it is chiefly chosen over and above others who are equally of value, and over and above God, who is infinitely more valuable than all of us put together, and we're out of sync with the reality, which is what the major subject is going to be about here in a moment. Realism. When we walk out of that state of truth, we then become seeking our own good. So good to others and good to self is okay, is right. It's actually be immoral to do otherwise. To not treat ourselves well is a serious problem, you know. And that's another subject, but to merely do everything for good to self, like, you could easily do this. You could seek somebody else's good for your own good. In other words, like we have the famous example in the Bible where Jesus points out this woman who puts in all that she had, you know, which was so little, but it was all that she had to be able to give. And she did it discreetly and whatever, and Jesus drew attention to her and compared her to those who did it for show, right? They did good to make themselves look good. And that happens all the time. And that's what we were talking about earlier. And so there are two types of people. Those who make their own priority, the highest priority, the good to self. They use confirmation bias and assumptions as their methodology in life. Because they have to be able to hide from the truth, otherwise they would be completely tormented going along. They have to silence the voice of God and the voice of reason and constantly have distractions and diversions to live with themselves and to go on. Of course, people dive into all these indulgences to try and drown that out, and they have their ups and downs and everything because they're living that lie and they know it. And they can't get what they're looking for ultimately. And the more they dive into it, the worse it gets. So that's the one type. And the other are those who seek their own good as much as they seek the good of others, while seeing themselves as a creature of God, of whom they receive everything from and owe everything to, and walk moment by moment under His care, while searching out and embracing all truth with His help and with His character. And that's a very concise statement that could be greatly enlarged. But the idea is that they are treating everything accordingly. Their neighbor as themselves, and God above all. Instead of other things as idols in their lives, other forms of seeking to fill the void, they have the void filled with God Himself. And not only that, but God works in them, as we're going to see in a moment. And they embrace the truth. And with His help, they endure the consequences of that, because it's not an easy thing to do. And you can't do that in and of yourself, because it's a very heavy responsibility. But with God, all things are possible. So the opposite of making assumptions is walking in humility and having a healthy respect for the truth above the consequences. The truth often hurts and calls people to sacrifice, and that's what I was talking about. One, to love your neighbor as yourself and to do to others as you want them to do you, it's going to constantly cost you. It is. It's not easy to do that. And to put God's interest above your own, or rather, not really above your own, but really for your interests to align with God's. That's a whole different way of looking at it. Then you end up being a subordination to that. Subordinate to that, not insubordination, I said. To be under His, like in other words, I've been trying to show with this series, which has been on hold for a while, on the real superheroes of the Bible. And I've been trying to show God's story throughout history as much as I can understand it. And the idea is to try and be in sync with that, to find that resonant frequency, if you will, and resonate with that. In other words, be a vessel of a heavenly nature. And so that's what it means to walk and with God, is to sympathize with Him and do all within your power to build that up and progress that along. And that was going to be the subject of a video that I was going to do. I've kind of prepared it for it. In contrast to Tesla's, the problem of increasing human energy in 1900, he wrote a long article, which I went over very thoroughly recently, the other day, in which he was coming from a deterministic and mechanical perspective of humanity, not looking at the individual, but the whole of humanity progressing evolutionary rise and fall progressions, but gradually getting supposedly better. Kind of like a deistic approach where with or without God, the earth and universe is progressing by itself in a way that is supposedly getting better. By whose estimation? How can you judge? According to that theory, at least. And so I was trying to prepare for the ultimate, well, the title would have been The Problem of Increasing Human and Heavenly Energy, or rather, on increasing human and heavenly energy, and show how we are not mechanical, just mechanical robots, if you will. Not even a robot, but a pure creature of instinct, is the way Tesla painted the picture, even though he gave lip service to mentioning Christianity and God when you look at carefully his article, it was clearly based upon the materialistic, deterministic philosophy. He stated that about himself. He said, I am but completely a creature of instinct. He said he could trace everything that he does from what he saw, whatever. But anyway, the point that I was going to make was, what we're going to talk about in a minute, is that we are to be walking with God is the ultimate thing that we're here for. This is the purpose of human energy, to bring heavenly interests into the human domain and make it truly peaceful and prosperous and happy and good and righteous and loving and so forth, rather than progressing along this completely delusional path as Tesla would have us, as the modern world races towards advancement. Advancement in what regards? Advancement in capabilities. Merely speed, motion, as he talked about, merely the achievements of man, like the building of the Tower of Babel. We see Tesla kind of symbolizing the Nimrod of the old, trying to, go up to the heavens and manipulate the earth to his advantage, and being merely a kind of a game and this endless pursuit. But that's another whole video to talk about that. But the real contrast to that is that is not our end goal. We don't need any of that, and we progress for the good of people, and we deal with the problems that, like, it was very hypocritical for him to point out how hypocritical the world was in not solving hunger and pure water and these three different issues that were very important to him, he said. But it was like, well, why were those more important than others? And really his whole agenda, his methodology, his approach, his spirit actually ended up doing the very opposite of what he said. And he talked about ending wars, but he created the war machine to enhance wars, and so forth. So this is what happens when we adopt the assumption principle and dive into the unknown and seek self-interest first, is that you destroy yourself and others. But true humility, healthy respect for the truth, and so forth, leads us with God. We end up being called to sacrifice, they said. We sacrifice our life to save others. So one man may sacrifice his life to save others because he has a truth at that moment that leads him to make such a major decision. He can close his eyes to it and assume he can't do anything, or that things hopefully will work out, or he can go with the truth. And that's the call that we have to make in life, whether big or small. The opportunity arises and we're tested. And that's what life is about, because this is only the beginning of eternity, and there's so much more, but this is the building blocks. This is the very beginning. This is where our character is tested and proven. And if we do adopt God's character and receive of Him, we can go on with Him. If we reject Him and want that, like I said, that self-interest, and make this life our only life, well, it's a sad reality, because what's waiting is absolute disaster. So another woman may see an injustice in their party and blow the whistle. Right? So we're talking about somebody taking a stand here for sacrifice. So I'm not talking about the present Democratic Party here, as I have no idea what all the motivations would be involved with that very complicated matter. It doesn't, it's not what I'm talking about. But say a woman may not wish to tolerate slander for the sake of the truth and the person slandered. Right? It's a very evil thing to slander anybody, even if you perceive them to be a bad person. To speak evil of somebody without a basis or a purpose is itself evil. Either gossip or actual slander, which are different things, are very destructive to society. So say she does this, it may cost her dearly, but may subject her to this, and may subject her to the same slander herself. People may slander her in fear that they may be slandered themselves if they don't go along with it, or if they go along with her, I should say. The truth costs all people daily who dare to live for God in the truth. It's a reality. Paul said, I die daily. And yet he was full of joy unspeakable. And that is very hard for people. It's impossible for them to conceive of that they could suffer and be joyful. Like, it doesn't make any sense to the natural mind. So that is why the path is narrow for such people and wide for the rest. Because people know. I mean, some people naively say the truth and have no idea that it's unacceptable to say the truth in so many quarters. And then they have a very shocking surprise. But by and large, most people know that if they were to come out with many things, that they'd have to pay the price for it. So the cost is too high for people. They count the cost, and it's not for them. That is not for me. The rich young ruler said all these things that he did, obeying the law and everything, and then Jesus said, go and sell all that you have, and give to the poor, then come follow me. And he knew it was the idol of his heart. He wasn't willing to do that. He had many riches, so he went away sad. And that's the thing. People aren't willing to give up what it takes to follow God. And, Jesus will put his finger on the idol of your heart. Even while I say it right now, you might think of what your idol might be if you have one or many. So it's very narrow for such people and very wide for the rest of the world, because, if you are of the world will receive you as its own, more or less, right? If you play the assumption game, you can have the sympathy of the world, right? But the whole world unites against those who dare challenge its foundations of self-interest and the freedom to assume what you want. Those are the two things: self-interest, assuming, hiding from the truth. Those are all together. It's been showing. And so the world unites against that. People that were warring with each other can stop for a moment and concentrating and silencing those people that would challenge both of them. Common enemy. Right? That's what they did to Jesus Christ. Right? So, like I said, have you ever noticed that just about any wild and crazy theory or people are tolerated? And while these various groups in fact fight against each other, that they will come together with almost one voice against anyone who will dare point out this fundamental and contradiction and immorality? They come together. And they just, like, the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, right? Well, that's what happens. Is people come together to attack, especially somebody who at all threatens their hypocrisy, threatens their assumptions, and exposes them possibly directly or indirectly. So I'm a student of history, as I usually show some books here. I got some history books here. And I can tell you, it was not for words about Jesus Christ that millions of people have been martyred over the last 2,000 years, as in this book we're going to talk about. But because, it wasn't just because of the words about Jesus, claiming to be a Christian. This is not the reason for their martyrdoms. It takes a lot to have somebody put to death. And it takes a certain thing only that caused most of these people to be murdered or martyred. But because, what was the reason? Because they lived such a life that Jesus lived and forsook this evil practice of making assumptions and lying and living for themselves. They forsook that, and gave themselves up for the glory of God and the good of others. Oh, they could tolerate doing good to others, but for the glory of God they will not endure that, if you're truly living for the glory of God. And what happens is, because they lived that life where they weren't going to go along with evil practices, with these things that imply all these assumptions that, and all these practices, right? The lying and the evil things in culture, they were killed for such reasons. You dare challenge us in our way of life, then you must be removed because you threaten it all. And that's the thing. That has happened time and time again. And it has happened by, it's not just happened by non-Christians attacking Christians. It's attacked, people have been, anybody who, even if they aren't even living that way, if they're perceived to be that way, they're a threat. This happens in other religions and other places in the world too, with people who dare challenge things. They're perceived to be a threat, and so they're made an example of, or they're quietly removed, or what have you. Now, in the past it was executing people, making them fearful. Now, it's not so popular to do that, so it's more like destroy their influence in certain ways, or destroy them financially, or attack them psychologically, or what have you. All these different ways now, or bribe people off, pay them off, or what have you. When it comes, I'm thinking now about the energy controversies that take place. That's what happens, you can see there. In regards to living godly, I don't think people are ever paid off not to be, but they are definitely attacked in many ways and removed, if they can be. So there are always particulars differing one from another in these martyrs, right? There are particular circumstances, and no doubt many insincere martyrs at times, people ended up like wanting to be martyrs, like to die, and obviously, you know, many believe that if they were martyred, they would instantly go to heaven, and you know, the whole jihadist mentality. I'm not saying that that word implies that, but that's the way people perceive it here in the Western world. The mentality that if you die, that you're instantly going to be rewarded for that. Now, that's not at all, like Jesus said just the opposite, that, or Paul said that even if you give your body to be burned, you have not love, then it is, it's not real, it's not acceptable to God, and it's a gross delusion. So love is the essential virtue, implying all other virtues, right? And so there are martyrs that were insincere, no doubt, and there was people probably thrown in the mix with real martyrs who didn't want to be, or who knows what. But there were a lot of martyrs, like millions over the last 2,000 years, and who can count all the numbers? But we're going to talk about Fox Book of Martyrs in a minute. But the real reason these people were put to the stake or persecuted was because they challenged this foundational evil. It had to be silenced, lest the camp be exposed, right? The threat, the idols be contradicted. So we've been talking about the Acts and Monuments of the Christian Church by John Fox. That's the real title. This is what's come to be called in condensed form Fox Book of Martyrs, and it's really a lot bigger than this. And this is 1,500 years of history from the first martyr Stephen in the Bible to through the apostles in the early church to most of the martyrs came from the Roman Catholic Church, causing countless deaths of people who dared question it. And like I said, it wasn't so much the particular doctrine, but the nature of questioning it, the grounds of not accepting it as an authority, and to dare challenge it. To again, we're going to talk now about Tyndale. So Tyndale was also a martyr at the time of John Fox, and they knew each other, of course. And Tyndale gave us the first English Bible written, translated from the original languages. And unfortunately it wasn't complete besides the New Testament and a good section of the Old Testament. But Tyndale, I'm going to read here. So Tyndale was a godly man, and he was a very accomplished scholar from very early on. Very, very interesting individual. And he ended up questioning the law at the time, which for 100 years was was in Oxford. It was illegal to even read the Bible in English. There was a translation, some translations into English. Wycliffe, much earlier on, translated from the Latin, which was not the original language, so it wasn't as accurate as Tyndale's version. 1534, this was translated. And so Tyndale was told that he couldn't bring the Bible to the common man. It was not allowed. He didn't understand that. And he ended up, at the same time that Luther was translating the Bible for the first time from the original into German. Tyndale was translating into English. And he ended up being betrayed, and attempts were made on his life. And then eventually he had made a translation, and then because he was betrayed, it was lost in the water. And then he ended up writing again. And so what happened was he translated words in ways that were unacceptable. And there's 5 key words that he really that really blew it for him, I guess you could say. So it was like, it wasn't merely the idea of translating the Bible into English and allowing people to have access to the Bible, but it was the true translation of the Bible that was dangerous. See, skeptics, which I used to be a skeptic myself, and I was very much against Christianity because of a reaction to others. Again, an assumption, right? Well, the critics have, or the skeptics generally say that the Bible itself is an oppressive thing and whatever, but why would an oppressive entity like the Roman Church at the time be forbidding people to have the Bible if it was actually supporting its cause? Well, no, they didn't want that, because it actually is really the only religious source on true, well, it's got the true philosophy for man, and the true idea of liberty, and the true idea of God, and what have you. All of our human rights really come from these scriptures, Old and New Testament. And so, but this is a threat to any oppressive power, is a threat. And so there's some examples here, and you can read about Tyndale, but ask yourself, first of all, before I get into those, ask yourself why Tyndale. There's very little focus on Tyndale as the man who was the most influential person in the English language, because this translation was the source of all subsequent translations immediately after, and paved the way for numerous phrases that we use today, and of course influenced the King James Bible. That was the primary source. And yet what's interesting is there's a very good reason to suppose that Tyndale was most persecuted for these 5 words. And what's interesting is even the King James Bible went back from Tyndale's proper rendering of the words to the Roman rendering of the words. And that was actually in the King James Bible's instruction from King James himself to use the old ecclesiastical words. And so they deliberately were, under order to translate it that way. And so let's look at these words. You're probably wondering, whoa, these are probably pretty serious words. But they're actually not. But they are in a sense. So let's look at them. So the word he translated, now this is coming from David Daniel, who is one of the foremost experts on Tyndale in recent times. And he has this long introduction showing all these things. And he translated the Greek word for elder as elder, not priest. Right? He translated the word repentance as repentance, not do penance. He translated congregation as congregation, not church. He translated charity as love. And confess became acknowledge. So, what's significant about all these words is that each one of these key words contradicted a major practice or institution or doctrine of the Roman Church. So, for example, elder, not priest, is a totally different thing. The idea of a priest was in the mold of the Old Testament idea, and that was quite a bit different than the idea of an elder or a minister. Now they're similar, but quite a bit different. The next one, repentance, as opposed to doing penance. Penance came around after the first persecution. The first major persecution, there was a number of Christians that lapsed. They were called the lapsed, and they ended up recanting and forsaking Christ under the pain of death. So they survived where others died, and then after that persecution stopped, the church, some of these people wanted to come back into the church, and there's great debate on how to deal with these people. So the idea of penance, which was not a brand new idea, to be honest, but it was a new thing coming into the Christian theology of proving your repentance, proving yourself to do a particular work. So that was a major blow to that. So many practices and things developed out of that whole idea of this solution, apparent solution to the problem of these people, that they proved themselves repentant, which is no doubt a difficult problem to figure out what to do with somebody under those circumstances. But penance is something that came about at the time of which the Reformation ended up generally rejecting these and many other ideas from the Roman Church. So doing penance is the second thing. Then congregation as opposed to church. See, now church was representing this building and this particular kind of structure rather than the congregation, the ecclesia. Is definitely not the word for a church. It's a body. Just like a board started off as being a board, and then it became people sitting around the board, and then it became the board without the wood. Completely different idea. How it's the evolution of the word board in the English language. But in this case, ecclesia never meant a building. In fact, the church was the body of Christ, the people of Christ. And then people came around together. Anyway, that's the third word. The fourth word, charity, as opposed to love, agape is the word. It was a meaning for a virtue, not a institution. And charity in the form of giving to people, or giving to a institution which was profitable. So this was unacceptable to change that whole usage of that word to actually be a personal thing, which was very comprehensive. You know, without love there is nothing. Like to say without giving alms or, you know, various acts of charity and make that the sum of all things could very easily be used to profit from if you're an institution receiving it. But if you are making it the nature of virtue itself, which is far more comprehensive, and Paul says, without love, or what they translated charity, you are nothing, right? So the whole meaning, vastly different with vast implications again. So we have these four, and there is a fifth, and I don't know why it's not mentioned here, and I keep forgetting now what it is. There were other words too, but Sir Thomas More was his great rival, who is considered now the patron saint of politicians. And he was chiefly responsible, even though he was put to death himself prior to Tyndale. Tyndale was captured because of him, and for the purpose of his great disdain for this whole project of Tyndale. So he calls him a beast. He called Tyndale a beast, as one of the hellhounds that the devil hath in his kernel, discharging a filthy foam of blasphemies out of his brutish beastly mouth, and calls him a deceiver and a hypocrite, puffed up with the poison of pride, malice, and envy, and so on. So without More, Tyndale would never have been gone after. More was responsible for having an inquisition in England and killing and burning at the stake many people, and then of course got his own opportunity to experience that himself even before Tyndale died. But you could blame More primarily for Tyndale's persecution. So here's a man who dared challenge the assumptions of the day, the fears, and what great cost. I mean, he had to go over to Europe and hide and write the Bible and bring it into the country, you know, and every one of these Bibles was burned. They were hunted down and burned in piles. And that's what they feared, these particular words, because they challenged the institution. And they brought it out so that the people were able to evaluate More. And the church, I don't call it the real church, but this institution didn't want to give people the ability to have access to God, was the real thing. They would have to come through a mediator. When it says in the Bible, there is only one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, that you can come to yourself without coming through somebody else, that we are to be a holy priesthood ourselves, come to God ourselves, and not be coming through another person or institution. And not that you can't benefit from being joined to others and partaking with them, but that's what I'm talking about, is this whole idea of the bias, of the great fear of letting man think for themselves. So this was the ultimate example of keeping people in ignorance, keeping them dependent upon another to tell them the truth, and under the pain of death not to have these Bibles. And so Tyndale was locked up in prison and in this dungeon in the tower for 2 years, and finally, and he wrote a book that his wife, who was also, sorry, not his wife, King Henry VIII's wife, was influenced by, and so it was used by Henry in his whole controversy with Rome about the divorce issue to try and find justification to leave Rome and be his own sovereign. And that's where he gained, anyway, that's another story. I shouldn't go off on that. But what happened was, while Tyndale was dying, he made a statement, "May God open the eyes of the King of England." His last words. And 6 months later, Henry, who, you know, obviously wasn't a good man, I don't think ever, but he decided to make that break with Rome. And there was still a lot of persecution under him in various ways, but now the Bible was freely able to be read, still with many, restrictions in that. But this is what happens when we come to that place where we persecute people for challenging us. It leads to, we can look back and say, oh, well, that happened then. Oh, yeah, that was crazy times. Just like we said, oh, how did these people feed their children these drugs and what have you? Well, these things still happen today in different forms. But we have these shining bright examples of these godly men, and they stood firm in their love towards their enemies even. They stood firm in their faith. They didn't care what came to them. They were serving Christ. They were serving the truth, and they walked in that light. And so in light of that, the verse I have here is, let's see Tyndale's character here. So, in the prologue to Romans, so the introduction to the book of Romans, he writes the last 5 paragraphs, I believe, because the other ones were from Luther. In the last paragraph, he writes this: "Now go to, reader, and according to the order of Paul's writing, even so do thou. First, behold thyself diligently in the law of God, and see there thy just damnation. Secondarily, turn thine eye to Christ, and see there the exceeding mercy of thy most kind and loving Father. Thirdly, remember that Christ made not this atonement, that thou shouldest anger God again. Neither died he for thy sins, that thou shouldest live still in them. Neither cleansed he, that thou shouldest return as a swine unto the old puddle again, but that thou shouldest be a new creature and live a new life after the will of God, and not of the flesh. And be diligent, lest through thine own negligence and unthankfulness thou lose this favor and mercy again." Now, no doubt, such statements, such piety, and such life has cause for him to be still suppressed. I mean, his name and influence was greatly suppressed in England because of all the pronouncements from these authorities under the pain of death. Tyndale was suppressed then, and he has continued to be ignored and suppressed today. Even though our Bible is the best example of his work, his character and what he shared in his notes about the Bible itself and the influence is not duly respected. It's in passing. And these words are very very deep, very powerful, and very contradictory to today's theology, for example. But he was a godly man, and none will dare come out against him because they know there's nothing that anybody could say to such a person, about such a person. But the silence is interesting, as I said. Why is there so little talk, So, anyway, I've been in contact with one of the most foremost scholars of Tyndale about that kind of subject, and it's pretty interesting conversations we've had. But now, the bottom line is this. John 3:19 to 21. "This, then, is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does bad things hates the light and avoids it, so that his deeds may not be exposed. But anyone who lives by the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be shown to be accomplished in God. Now this is one of the most profound statements of all time. It's a concise statement about the essence of the judgment. How more important can we get than something like this? The very thing that we will stand before God is stated right here. The very essence of what the essential issues are with us. Concisely stated here. This is not only part of the judgment, this is not an aspect of it, this is the judgment. This is what my whole subject is about here. So the light has come. Jesus is the light of the world, but light, individual light, the truth here and there, has been given from God. It has come into the world, right? God created the world, and though right now it is under a curse, still the light from heaven shines. It shines brightly. And people, they loved darkness. We all have loved darkness rather than the light, because our deeds were evil. The motivation of our heart was selfish, and that's why we ran from the light, because we didn't want to be under the obligation of dealing with the truth. We were running from it. And why did we run from the light? Why did we do? Everyone who does bad things, why do they run from the light? It goes hand in hand here. Because, so that his deeds may not be exposed, right? Exposed in himself, exposed for what they are, from their father, the devil, which is really who is the source of their inspiration, if you will. And this is the fact that people don't want to be exposed for their character. And that's why they run from the light. That is why they're biased in assuming, because they don't want the implications of that. But on the contrast of that, and this is why everybody's going to be judged for that alone. But anyone who lives by the truth comes to the light, right? So they come to the light because they live for the truth. They embrace it. They say, more, more. You know, I want it. I want to share it. I want to give it. I don't want to hide from it. And why? So that his works may be shown to be accomplished in God. This is not a pride thing. This is giving glory to God, right? This is giving praise to God. Not, I'm proud that God is working through me or something. I'm proud and look what I've accomplished. No, this is, I'm your humble servant, Lord. You know, use me any way possible. You know, and that's where these great actions happen. These three men, incredible men, made huge changes to our world. And so this is the whole purpose of our lives, as I said earlier, that God can work through us in showing love. So here we are finite creatures that are so easily mistaken. We have all sinned, and we have all failed fundamentally. And we're frail creatures, we're needy creatures, and yet God somehow mysteriously can motivate us to do good in those trying circumstances and show his love to others through us. That is the purpose of our existence here. And so through all eternity, it would be like a big movie being played about how God in so many various ways showed his love to people, even the people who did not care, that he cared enough to give them a chance. And more than you'll ever know until that day, just what he did. And it's amazing. It truly is amazing. So one last thing I want to share here. Asa Mahan, we talked about him sometimes. I published all of his works. He was definitely a martyr for Christ as well. He didn't die by persecution, but he certainly lived a constant life of persecution and could have died at any moment. His children were stoned on the streets of Cleveland in 1830. Now they survived, but they were physically stoned with rocks because he was the only man in Cleveland. This is Cleveland, Ohio, people. He was the only man or only preacher that preached against or who was against slavery and did not believe in the institution of slavery, of course, and was the biggest influences against slavery in American history. And anyway, he was the first president of Oberlin College, which is the first school to allow black people and women to have an education. The first co-ed school, the first this, the first that, the first so many things. We have so much to, we have so much taken for granted today that came from Asa Mahan and Charles Finney and the likes of those people that laid their lives down for the sake of the truth. But not only that truth, but so many other truths. And what happened is that he wrote this book. He wrote many books that are considered classics. I republish all of them on my website, truthandheart.com. And at the end of his life, not the very end, but he was 83, he wrote this book, A Critical History of Philosophy, in 2 volumes. This is volume 1, 1,000 pages. And he wrote the first part of this book in 83 pages, and then it took him 13 years to finish the rest of the book. This is one of the most important books that you could ever read. This is definitely, my top 3 books. I got the Bible, got Finney's Systematic Theology, and I got this Critical History of Philosophy. Definitely my top 3 books. Everything else comes far behind that. But other books by these authors were very important as well. Now, the thing about it is that, what's important about this book is in relevance to what we're talking about. So again, we talked about history, we talked about science, and this is absolutely essential to at least read the beginning parts of this to know. And like I said, you can read it on my website for free. All my books that I publish, I put on freely on my website, and have done that for 25 years in this ministry. I haven't had the website for 25 years, but I've had this ministry for 25 years, 26 years. And republishing old classics from that time period. This is 1883. So anyway, what's significant about this, especially in related to scientific endeavors, is, like the whole scientific method and what have you, is being properly prepared to do research, and how you can have successful research, which again is not making assumptions. And like I've often said, like in my videos and to people, that when you're doing scientific research, your failures need to be considered very important in the process, because you gotta consider nothing as a failure. A failure is someone to be, truly a failure would be a bias, a assumption, a twisting of the scientific processes. And so there is no failure, there is only learning in that experience. But I want to talk about the core matter here that we've been talking about, assumptions. And so, without going into too much, I'm going to give you 2 sections here and make some comments. So he says here in the opening, principles and facts of true science as distinguished from assumptions, opinions, conjectures, etc. A question of fundamental importance here arises, to wit, how shall we distinguish principles and facts of real science from mere assumptions, opinions, beliefs, conjectures, or guesses? which may be employed as principles or facts in the construction of systems of science. So how may we do this? A ready answer can now be given to this inquiry, an answer the universal and absolute validity of which must be admitted as soon as the subject is understood. See, what I like about these guys is they spoke with authority. It means speaking with authority is avoiding opinionizing, speculating, assumptions, all that, and only presenting the solid facts in an authoritative way, and not using weak arguments or guesses, which is the methodology today to win an argument is to overprove your case, to try and win it at any cost, to use whatever can be an influence. And this throws suspicion upon your whole argumentation because it shows no integrity. Integrity is avoiding anything that's not conclusive in establishing a claim. I mean, there are things that are evidence that are not conclusive that can be mentioned, but when you try and make evidence itself proof when it doesn't measure up to proof, this is not speaking with authority. This is not, it may convince the weak-minded, but it doesn't approve itself to your conscience. And this is why I so love this influence. It's been the biggest influence in my life. The Bible, these 3 books, and all the other ones related to them have been so important for me because they've molded me to try and avoid doing that, making these assumptions. And so, anyway, let me just read on here. Principles as distinguished from mere assumption. So affirmed systems of science may undeniably be based either upon valid principles or upon mere assumptions. That is, unauthorized judgments employed as principles in the construction of such systems. Unauthorized, remember. How shall we distinguish the former from the latter? Every judgment of the former class has undeniably, and as all thinkers admit, these immutable and inseparable characteristics: absolute universality and necessity. So that's what every judgment has as a principle of science. In other words, it is absolutely impossible for the mind to conceive that they are not, and must not be valid in themselves, and must not hold true in respect to all objects and events to which they are applicable. And so, absolute universality and necessity. So that has to be the foundation. And I don't want to go enlarge upon that too much because this is a little bit longer section here that I want to focus on more specifically. So what he did in this book is, instead the history of philosophy up until he did this book, and generally still continue to today, because evidently he was ignored, but he was one of the most brilliant philosophers of all time. I can easily say that. But up until his time, the history of philosophy was a mere chronology of individual thinkers and not organized specifically into systems. And so the student of philosophy would be just bogged down and literally depressed after reading all the conflicting views and not really knowing how to make sense of it all. What way do they really relate to each other, and is there any system to this madness? And so he actually developed for the first time a classification system that grouped all things. Now he did talk about people specifically, but in the context of their particular worldview. And so what happened was, he grouped all philosophies, all worldviews, if you will, into 4 major categories. There are subcategories within those categories, but there's only four possible realities possible in the history of philosophy, which is that there's only a spiritual world, which he called the idealist, which pantheist is what we know by that term usually. The idea that there is one substance of all only, not more than one. There's only one substance to the universe and the existence. And that substance is a spirit. There is no material world in that worldview. And this is, most of the Eastern religions have this belief more or less, that the physical world is really an illusion, and even pain and evil are an illusion. And that the idea of God is an impersonal being in which we are all one with, right? So this is one of the most popular views in the world by sheer numbers. And so this was the one category. The other category would be opposite to that, still believing that there is one, only one existence to reality, but that is materialism. So everything is really a function of chemistry, chemical process, and really, in one sense, is completely opposite in saying that there is only a physical manifestation of things. But in essence, there really probably isn't really any difference between the two philosophies, but a matter of maybe words. But I don't want to go off track on that point. But these are two opposite philosophies. One saying that there is a material world but a spiritual world. One saying that there isn't a spiritual world but only a material world. And then you have the third. So in reaction to that, in rejecting those options, the third alternative is to say, to look at how each one of those philosophies attempted to disprove the other. They opted for disproving both of them at the same time and having no reality. In other words, skepticism, and there's no way to know anything. So just literally unbelief or ignorance, agnosticism. There is no such thing as atheism, because atheism is to posit something that's impossible. It's to say there is no such thing as God, which is unprovable. You cannot prove that. You'd have to be God to disprove the existence of God. So it is rather a joke to try and affirm the term atheist. Agnostic even really isn't honestly tenable. But that's another subject. So the idea of questioning everything, questioning our... so the idealist made you want to question the material world, right? And throw suspicion on anything pertaining to evidence, pertaining to physical realities, right? And say this is all a figment of your imagination. You know, it's like a dream that we're in, right? And then the materialist said the idea of personal consciousness is an illusion itself. I mean, that's quite a contradiction of terms, but the idea of a spirit world is just a fable, and all that's real is chemical processes, like Tesla was saying. I'm just a deterministic product of my environment and evolutionary processes and what have you. Again, there's variations of both of these philosophies. So the skeptic comes along, and these skeptics can be leading scientists and what have you, and maybe even have an appearance of being a materialist or idealist, or sometimes overlapping some of these thoughts in ways like you see Tesla kind of unsure where he really stands, you know, by his lingo. But the skeptic goes and says, I'm skeptical of everything, you know, even of my own existence, and you know, how can I be sure of anything, and so forth. And it's very sophisticated, and it actually has succeeded in influencing our present modern Western world more than all the other. I mean, realism was the biggest effect upon our Western world primarily But in recent times, the decay of our culture has been the result of the skeptical alternative, in which says that we should question everything. And so it has put a great distrust in primarily God, of course. The idea of God and the idea of morality would be questioned, of course, as well. And so the idea of meaning, of purpose, and everything that is good and right, and everything itself is called into question. And you have all sorts of beliefs, philosophies stemming from that lead to the absurd and what have you. So these are the three main categories that actually contradict each other and defeat each other. And then the only true theory, the only alternative, is the realistic philosophy, which you can imagine then is the belief in a material and a spiritual world, which obviously has a duality of existences in this universe, which is material world and a spiritual world, and obviously showing then how all those other options are wrong. They defeat each other. But what is common about the three, in distinction to the real? So in summary of his point on realism, without getting too long-winded about it, our apprehension of matter and spirit is verified. On the authority of the same criteria, realism affirms our apprehension of spirit and matter to be forms of contingent but absolutely valid knowledge. The reason that while, what I didn't mention, I was going to mention this earlier, before I read on, how is that verified? Because it would be good to focus on that a little bit. So the difference is that things are as they appear, right? The skepticism of all those three philosophies is assuming that we can't trust our primary intuitions. We can either, in the one, trust some of them, or the other, the opposite ones, or none of them, according to the skeptic. So, I'm talking about the absolute skeptic. I'm not talking about being skeptical, which I am very skeptical in the true sense of the term. But the idea of disbelieving our primary faculties, the very core perceptions that we make that are irresistible, right? And these particular camps are trying to say that these are illusions to us. And they're making the assumption, which is baseless, because these are the very things that we know irresistibly. We cannot deny them. They're, like I read earlier, they're universally, they're something that we can't not think of. They're something that we cannot think opposite of. And so naturally we're supposed to believe these things. We can't help but believe them. That's the thing. There's no way to disbelieve them. So there has to be an assumption that they're not valid for these groups to have this. So what I'm trying to say is there are certain things that he's going to mention here that are undeniable. And really, as I said, I worked in mental health for 3 years, in which when people disbelieve those realities, they're declared not to be fit to be on their own. They're needing help because they don't believe these things that we all know are true. And that is when we live that way practically in real life. But when we can merely say that that's the case in our philosophy, and as long as we don't practice that in the real world, we won't get put on the drugs and put in a group home or before it was an institution, because we're practically living out our philosophy. But that's the reality of these philosophies that are trying to say, don't trust your senses. Don't trust these various things that are obviously true. These are just innate prejudices. And we can't go, why? Why can't they trust in those things? Because they don't want to, as I just read what Jesus said. They don't want the implications of that light. And they're messed up in that whole reasoning. So after that assumption is made that these things are unreliable, everything else they say logically flows. If you grant them that first bit, and that's what he's trying to show here in these paragraphs, is that we have absolutely valid knowledge of both spirit and matter. So the reason is that while in external and internal perception, we have a direct, immediate, and absolute consciousness of them as actually existing, and as such as distinct and separate realities. The fundamental apprehensions of them, which we thus obtain, can no more be changed, modified, or displaced from human thought than we can our apprehensions of a circle or a square. We cannot help but perceive them, and we cannot help but perceive them, the two types of realities, as separate, distinct, spirit and material. There's no way to distinguish them from each other. So in the same way that we know that they are real, we know that they're separate. And so why assume that we're being deceived? There's no basis for that. There's no reason. In fact, all of our researches show that we're not being deceived, and that it is one marvelous system, which I'm going to end off on shortly, an example. Now, so I want to give another example quickly. So you're driving down the road and you see this, you see something on the road, and you conclude that it is water or heat. If you're me, you say it's either heat or water, because by experience, right? But where lies the mistake of assuming that it was water? Does it lie in your perception? Did your perception deceive you? Or was it something else? Was it your assumption, which was the will, the choice that you have to prematurely conclude without basis? You weren't close enough to verify exactly what this was. Sure, it looked like water, but it doesn't mean that you needed to conclude it was water. Until you have a working experience to be able to predict that it is water, you have no reason to base it on that. In fact, experience shows us that it's often heat on the road that creates this almost mirage, not a mirage in that case, but it's a, whatever you call it. But anyway, it's a good example of showing how people, they use that as an illustration to try and discredit your perception of things. And the fact is, your eyesight may be impaired, but you still see exactly what you see. You may not see it as it really is because of an impairment, but you see all that you can about it. It's your assumption that makes you in error about anything. And that's why, as a scientist or experimenter, you need to be extremely careful with coming to conclusions, especially about failure, about other people's characters, such as, oh, this person, I couldn't replicate him, so therefore he must not have been telling me the truth. And it's very bad to try and discredit somebody because you were not able to replicate what they were saying. And so we find this all the time. But going back to this, let's read further. So we have many variable and shadowy assumptions, opinions, and conjectures in regard to these substances. Our apprehensions of the self as thinking, feeling, willing, personal existence and of the not-self as a real exterior substance having extension and form, never change and cannot be displaced. Space, time, spirit, matter, then, are realities in themselves, and as such are noble and known realities. Our apprehensions of them also have all possible characteristics of forms of valid knowledge, of verities of science, and realism rests upon no other basis than the rock of truth. So, these are the realities that are in debate. I mean, for those of you who are not studying philosophy, you might be like scratching your head. Those of you in the real world are like, what? You know, do people who actually claim that there is no such, these things are just figments of our imagination, that maybe they've been like watching too many science fiction movies too long. And that's really the reaction of the average person who doesn't get over mystified in this false philosophy speculations. And that's all because all these questions come because the adoption of assumptions throughout all of our culture from day one, from the earliest beginnings of our education. And so naturally if people are accustomed to doing that, then they can feel the need to, you know, do that about everything, about God himself. So section number 4, miscellaneous topics and suggestions. Materialism, idealism, and skepticism, all constructed throughout after one and the same method, begging the question. This is why I wanted to end this topic on somebody who was far more advanced than I possibly ever will be in describing these things so well. He says, we have reserved for a separate consideration a very important characteristic of the systems above named, the systems whose claims we have already, it may be thought, sufficiently investigated. There's no more vicious form of scientific and logical error known to the human mind than that which goes by the name of begging the question, an error which consists not only of the substitution of assumptions in the place of principles, and the induction of false instead of real facts, but in the adoption of mere assumptions which are really identical with the conclusions desired to be reached. I mean, begging the question. Here lies the fundamental vice of materialism, of idealism in all of its forms, and finally of skepticism. The basis principles of all these systems are assumptions which are identical in their proximate and final deductions, a fact which marks them all in common as systems of seductive error. This charge we will now proceed to verify. So he's already shown each one of them in more detail, and now this is just a summary showing that they all do the same thing. They beg the question. It's a leap of logic, a leap to a conclusion. So you prove your conclusion by asserting it, which is an assumption. The fundamental issue between realism and with it theism, the belief in God, personal God, and materialism on the one hand and idealism on the other is this: whether one and but one substance or principle of all things does exist. So that's what those two maintain, idealism and theism. There's just one substance. So unless this one issue be granted or verified by proof against realism, not one step can be taken in the direction of either of the other systems. This issue is openly begged by the assumption that but one substance and principle of all things do exist, an assumption not even professedly evident, and for the verification of which by proof no attempt is made. Right? The validity of the assumption, on the other hand, is taken for granted, and upon it, as admitted principle, a system is at once reared up. So because they merely assert there's one substance and don't prove it, they prove things that show there is a substance, but they don't disprove that there isn't another substance, which you would have to do to prove there's only one substance. This assumption being granted, every issue with realism is settled at once. For if but one substance does or can exist, matter and spirit cannot both be real. So only one, if you grant one, the other one can't be true. And if only one can exist, one of them can't be existing. But who does not perceive that the issue with realism is begged? And begged by a mere assumption which is identical with the deduction desired. Thus, the first step is taken in the exclusive conformity to one of the most vicious principles known to science. As soon as this first step has been thus taken, a fundamental issue arises between the two rival systems. Materialism on the one hand and idealism on the other. One of these, the previous assumption being granted, must be true and the other false. How can it be known which is true and which is false? Not by intuition or by deduction, the claims of each against each other being absolutely balanced. Now hear that out really carefully. All the philosophers of note agree on the phenomena. And that you may find surprising. It's not that they don't agree on the phenomena. They agree on the validity of the phenomena as being known, being able to be known. Which sounds really absurd to say, and it's hard to even wrap your mind around it if you haven't been accustomed to hearing people say that. But they know, intuition reveals these phenomena, right? All agree. Question is intuition divided? Is some of it real and some of it not? And how can you determine that? He's saying there is no way to do that. And that's where the skeptic goes and says, well, I just believe either one of them. So Mr. Huxley is undeniably right when he affirms that our knowledge of what we call the material world is, to begin with, at least as certain and definite as that of the spiritual world. Right? So don't get him wrong. He wasn't a realist. So how do you think he gets out of that? And how, if that was the case, which is a very interesting admission, that's what I had just said, that our knowledge, all agree that our knowledge is as definite of both. So on what basis then can an advance be made in the direction of either of these systems? By a naked assumption that begs the issue? By nothing else, and by nothing else. This advance the materialist makes by the assumption that knowledge is possible but in its exterior form, or in respect to things without us, and is real in this form. This involves, on the principle of identity, the validity of the material hypothesis in all its fundamental forms and deductions. This step the materialist takes, we repeat, not by showing that his hypothesis is self-evidently validity, or is a demonstrated truth, nor after he has invalidated the assumption of the idealist, but by viciously begging the question at issue. Having assumed the validity of his principle, he goes on and rears up the whole superstructure of his system. Now, I believe it was his grandson, Aldous Huxley, that made the great statement, I don't have it in front of me, but in the book Means and Ends, where he admits that he denied, and that they did, my contemporaries, have denied the existence of morality, which would be part of the whole, or meaning in life, and morality, would be part of the spiritual side of things. So he said, we denied it on the basis of a reaction against the Christianity of the day. We denied it because we willed it to be that way. In so many words, he said the same thing. So in other words, and I've seen the response of the skeptics to try and walk around his statements, but it was a real open admission that it was for the sake of their erotic and lustful quest to deny the meaning. They simply willed it to not be. It was a leap in logic. And this is years after Mahan wrote these kinds of things. They admit it. I mean, and you can find these quotes here and there, and I have a whole books on those quotes, and I have their original sources, the original books too, that say them, in which they admit this assumptive principle, but they admit it more because in the end, it's exactly the way Jesus said, to escape morality, to escape the implications of walking in the light, and really the fear of serving God, which I honestly can tell you, when I was in my youth and I was running from authority, let's just say, I didn't care about that. I was running from God. I didn't want to serve Him. I didn't know who He was, and I had a terribly wrong conception of God. I knew He was real, and I didn't want to serve Him. And it wasn't that because I wanted to indulge, I just didn't care to. I mean, I guess that is a form of indulgence, but anyway, the materialists and these philosophers end up admitting these sort of things in everyday casual life. Their life shows that, for example, but then also in passing statements that they'll admit things. So as against the materialist, the idealist begs the question, not on grounds or arguments, but on the naked assumption that knowledge is possible only in its interior form and is actual in that form. The condition of valid knowledge, he affirms, without proof or argument, is a synthesis of being and knowing. This assumption not only begs the question against the materialist, but involves on the validity of a series of identical propositions, the whole system of idealism. And then he goes on to show the subsystems within each of those models or views, contradictory, like he talks about dual idealism and what have you. And so each one of these affirming different realities in contradiction. And so what is the basis for any of them defeating or disproving the other, or being merely an opinion, because they cannot be justified because they're all based upon assumption. So they defeat each other, their own systems self-destruct within their own warring parties, just like the whole evolution, macroevolution debate, where you have the more classical Darwinian naturalists who believe in gradualism and evolution over long periods of time, thus the many millions of years necessary to accomplish this impossible task. But also then you have the faction that is more newer, which in my day I studied more Stephen Jay Gould. In the 70s, he was the big name, bringing up this punctuated equilibrium, this idea which was formerly called the hopeful monster, where when Darwin had said in his Origin of Species, which I have there, that if my theory will be invalidated if we don't find in the genealogical record, abundant transitional forms. In other words, if we don't see step by step, like species changing gradually, from one thing to another, then his theory will be easily disproven. And like he said, even in the case of the eye, he didn't even see how it was possible for the eye to evolve at all, because really when it has to be perfectly functional to be useful, and there's no way to conceive of the eye doing that. But anyway, the point is, there was no transitional forms that I can feel comfortable in calling such. Certainly there was extinct species, but I'm aware of the various transitional forms being brought up. But the point is, the lack of them in mass disproved gradualism to so many evolutionists, so they went for this leap of faith, another assumption that because we don't see them, we assume that it happened in spurts, either instantly or in so fast progression that there was no trace left of them. So this becomes a very useful tool but it's based upon assumptions. And I had a really unique example of this when after I became a Christian, I went back to high school, which I had dropped out, and I was in grade 13, which we had grade 13 at the time, biology class, so it's like first year university credit that we got credit for at the time in Ontario. And my professor was a very, very vocal anti-creationist. He wasn't just an evolutionist. He was very aggressively condemning of Christianity pretty much every single day as a political agenda, which I have to agree that much of the Christianity today is exactly what he said. And that's where I can relate to atheists, because I was very skeptical myself in the same way. And skeptics, he wasn't an atheist, my teacher, but he was a very strong anti-creationist. And so every day he made issue and poked fun and did all those things. And so every day, I never said I was a Christian or anything, but I ended up asking him very carefully considered questions. And of course, each one of them was some kind of very big enigma in their systems. And so every day I would find an article on my desk before I came in, and it was something that I usually had already read. And so then I had a follow-up question based upon my knowledge of that issue in that article, in which then there would be another article the next day, and it was quite an adventure. But there was a lot of respect between us, or at least he had for me. I couldn't naturally have respect for the way he conducted himself, but what I found was, so I decided to do my independent project on the heart of the matter, the most difficult thing for the evolutionist, which is, and this is not a distraction from what I'm saying in this whole subject matter, so bear with me. So I went to the heart of the matter, which was abiogenesis, which, if you don't know what that means, is life coming from non-life. So how did life evolve, supposedly? Instead of going from monkeys to humans, let's go right down again to the very first assumption that life came from non-life. And of course, I tackled that subject. I wrote a little booklet. I think it was my first book that I ever wrote, and called The Implausibility of Abiogenesis on the Primitive Earth. And I didn't use impossibility because I didn't want to be necessarily offensive to everyone. So I gave that to each student in the class, and I gave a presentation that lasted half an hour longer than I should have. And my teacher didn't stop me, and I presented the lies in the textbook, my textbook, in which made absolutely deceitful claims about the Miller experiments way back, in which he portrayed it that they actually proved the existence of the ability to create life, that those experiments proved it. Actually, what they did was disprove it. So I proceeded to show 7 or 8 absolutely critical arguments that disproved the possibility of life coming from chemical processes on the early Earth, given all the details that are allowed in the consideration of what the Earth was like supposedly billions of years ago, and what have you. So, just briefly, to give you one example that you probably have never heard of, the idea of the right and left hand molecules. So without getting deeply into that, in natural processes without life form, amino acids appear equally. They have mirror images of each other. They can be either left or right-handed. When you look at them in a way. Anyway, the point is, so there's the concept of right and left-handed. So in any kind of natural, undisturbed environment that is not influenced by a living being of any sort, they always become equally 50%, one and the other. But in living things, they have to be left-handed. Or I think at least most living things. But they have to be always left-handed. They cannot function with right-handed. So there's no way to account for that by any natural processes, how anything could have occurred, and no one's ever been able to come up with any scenario, or because everything always in nature tends towards equilibrium. Even with this lightning bolt with the Miller experiment, it still produces always, under all these different conditions, left and right-handed. So you cannot have a mixture of both. You cannot have the functioning of one, in link and so forth. So that was a major problem. It's not well known to the average person. I mean, you've got all sorts of other characteristics, like you couldn't have oxygen, you need oxygen, and it's catch-22. All these different things that I brought about, and my sources were from evolutionists themselves, who are admitting these particular problems. So at the end I presented that, my teacher, who had been, I said, very aggressively anti-Christian and anti-creationist, he actually congratulated me in front of everybody and said, I can't respond to anything that you've said, and it's been very well presented, and I congratulate on you on not quoting the Bible, or not merely, like exactly what we're talking about, merely made an assumption or leap into that subject, but you actually looked into the evidence and presented a fair case. And he said, I accept evolution by faith. And it was like, to look in the classroom was just something I'll never forget. The students, what? This is not what you've been portraying all along. And he just comes right out with it and just says it. He said, now what exactly he meant by that, it might have meant that aspect of evolution. I'm going to grant him that's probably what he meant. But he didn't qualify himself. He just blanketly said it. And he said, well, I just couldn't understand the divine figure as doing it by creation. Like it would be so beyond him or them or whatever. He wasn't, maybe he was a deist or something like that. So it had to be by evolution. And he said, well, I'll try and keep in touch with you, and maybe if I can respond to you, I'll contact you. Never did. So I got top marks in that class and got a little bit of a lower score because I went over my time, but otherwise I got high 90s in that class, and it was just a really neat experience. But it just showed the textbook that made these absolutely lying statements. It wasn't just exaggerated, it was flat out lying. I pointed out, my teacher finally conceded to that and to all the points that I was making, and then came out with it and just had a moment of truth and just said, well, I mean, what was he going to do? I mean, these were points that I was quoting all these sources, and they were, you know, really highly accredited sources, right? So now I want to say one last thing, but that, again, to finish up that, that is what we're dealing with in the scientific world. What is the basis for all this suppression and mistakes of views of things and unwillingness to concede or consider or tolerate people is because of assumptions. And so let's give you one last example, which is from a book that I published when I published these old books, called The Philosophy of the Plan of Salvation by James Barr Walker. And this is a classic that's been well read over the last over 160, 70 years now. Anyway, it's a book on the evidences for Christianity, and very unique, very well written. Again, another student of Oberlin, he was, I found out later. Anyway, very effective. At the very beginning, he brings up this story that deals with the heart of the matter. I want to end it with this today. So, you have this hypothetical story which represents the situation of, well, at least skepticism and the whole problem of assumptions and evil assumptions. So you have this story of these two men that get stranded on this island. Their boat crashed and what have you. They're the only survivors. And we'll call it, well, what's his name now? Well, B and C. Contumax was the C, and Benignus. Yeah, Benignus and Contumax. So Benignus arrives upon the island, and he is so upset that, you know, his plans are thwarted, and there's nothing on this island that will help him, and that he loathes the fact of making a decision to come out there, and he's just down in the dumps. And Contumax, his first response is to praise God that he survived, and you know, hope that that he survived thus far, that he was going to continue on some way or another. And so he goes, instead of just sinking in despair and sitting down, he goes and searches out, just hoping for the best. And this is a different state of being, in which if you know that God does exist, which we all do know, but you have confidence in his goodness and superintendence, his ability to take care of us in need, then you can go with that. It's not an assumption. You can walk with that. You can trust him. And so he continues on in that, and he finds these rocks, and then he goes up and says to Benignus, he says, "Look, it looks like there's a shelter over there." And Benignus is like, "No, that's just the rocks. There's nothing there." So Contumax goes up there and he goes into it and says, "Look, no, this shelter is made so that we can escape the elements here, and it's purposely, the rocks are placed in such a way that, that will shelter us. So of course Benigmus reluctantly comes up there and comes in and partakes of the shelter, and then still complains about it, that, oh, I'm doomed to die here, and blah blah blah. And then Contumax proceeds to look throughout the shelter and finds this box, and inside this box is these clothes in which they can get out of their wet clothes and now put on these nice dry warm clothes, and Benigmus is reluctant to put them on because they're shabby looking clothes. They're not suitable for him in taste, and he's complaining about that, and oh wow, this and that. And Contumax is thankful. He's like, well, think about it, obviously this has been a cave, or this has been a setting that somebody's made for people in our circumstances to care for us in the time of need, that we could survive here for a bit. And but Benigmus is all complaining and saying, oh no, these are drabby looking clothes, and of course Contumax is saying, well, they're the best that we could possibly have for the circumstances, because these are the best adapted to not be damaged by the elements and by moth or what have you. So they fit, they work perfectly. They're perfectly adapted for our circumstances, right? So that's the key to this whole thing, this whole analogy. And so then Benigmus keeps complaining on, and but Contumax keeps looking and finds further that there is means to make a fire and keep themselves warm. And of course he sets up this fire and says more, gives glory to God, and personally to God, and is really thankful to this person that provided these provisions, right? And Contumax is all complaining that he'd rather be somewhere else, and continually arguing with him, about the whole idea of the goodness of this person, and goes on about, oh, these probably are pirates who own these things. And Contumax is like, well, if they were pirates, we would see, other kinds of evidence, like definitely people don't care, and would have different clothing, obviously, and different treasures there, not humble things like this. And then of course he goes and searches more, and he finds food, that non-perishable food, just carefully stored away. And then of course Benigmus is like still reluctant to admit anything, but yet nevertheless partakes of the food as well, and then proceeds to fully engage in a real dialogue about the nature of these things, and surely that it doesn't prove that this was a good character, a good person who did this sort of thing, and he's got every argument figured out to the contrary. And what this does is, it's kind of a sarcastic but it's effective way of bringing out the nature of not optimism in the unrealistic way, but realism. In other words, this is the way, the true attitude is to be in relation to light and in the creation, in a way that it's not that we assume things, we walk and we experience the revelations of God in the way of these, like we talked about, primary intuitions. And God reveals himself to us in various ways, and then he reveals his goodness to us, so we can walk with that. We don't assume anything, we trust him according to his word and according to his revealed character. And that's totally different, a trust, than an assumption. And it's also based upon a proper character, a proper response to evidence, not a closing of the mind, but a willingness to stand corrected, a willingness to adapt to our circumstances. And God is willing to meet with us as we walk accordingly to that. So when he doesn't make things, he doesn't give us more than we need. If he does, that's a curse to us. In other words, when somebody is given things, it's usually a sign that they have been given up of God. It can be a sign, I should say. It's not usually. It can be a sign when God no longer allows people to experience these trials. These trials can be used to get us to seek out the nature of things, question things. When we have these, for example, life and death experiences, it really forces us to consider our priorities and the nature of things. And when we come to the place when everything works out for us and we're successful in our sins, this is where the world can consider that a confirmation of that immorality isn't checked by God. But it's actually a judgment of God when you are confirmed in your sin and everything's prosperous. Like you could see these people who actually admit, like the Katy Perrys in this world, that admit to selling their soul to the devil, and then suddenly they're climbing the charts and extremely successful. Not to say that they might not experience some trying circumstances, but what's interesting is that isn't a blessing to have everything go your own way in your sin. Being able to be kept humble, being tried, and knowing your weaknesses, knowing your state of dependence upon God is what you need. And so pain and different things that people consider negative are sometimes blessings in disguise. And ideally we would never have experienced that except for sin coming into this world. So that's another whole complicated subject, but the point is our attitudes is what I'm talking about. So to be honest scientifically in our research is very important, and to know the limits of our investigations, safety-wise, morality-wise, we have to be very careful that we don't just, if we can do some process, that we bring it to the world when it could be potentially dangerous. And that's where I want to say all this talk, I don't want to be misunderstood. I do believe in suppressing things that are dangerous. And I think there could very well be times where things have been prevented because they were dangerous to society. And so, I think some things, like a lot of things, are very immoral and shouldn't be done. And, in science there's a lot of gray areas that are hard to decide on, and I don't think that it's easy to come to conclusions on. But we need to be always very cautious in that. And so that's my whole idea here, is that I want to present being absolutely honest about everything and coming into that state of contentment with the truth, that you're not running from it. In your life, I know in my life how much I've run from the truth. I remember running from God, like feeling like Jonah. I didn't want to do his will. I don't know why exactly, but obviously based upon prejudice. And we all know this experience where we're running from the truth. And some people joke and say ignorance is bliss, and they're revealing the immorality of that jest, that that joke that, yeah, it means you have less responsibility, so you think, but you're still responsible for what you decided not to learn about, and you'll be judged for that. And not in this life. You may be prosperous, you may get away with things, but you'll never be content, never be happy. But I'm not arguing that you should do things for the purpose of being happy or content, because really when you find true happiness, it's always by surprise. You never expect to find it the way you seek it. So in other words, you don't directly seek happiness. You experience it as a result of giving. Like you end up coming to the end of yourself, and you throw yourself at the mercy of God, and you let go of all your selfish ways, all the lying, all the assumptions, like I said, and all that's implied, all the vice and the messed up world life, and you throw yourself at His mercy, and you say, whatever, Lord, I'm yours, I don't deserve anything. And you let go and you give yourself to Him, and suddenly, you're not expecting it that moment, you're just undone. You're broken about all that you've done and how much you've gone against the truth and the light. And suddenly, you find happiness for the first time, real happiness. I mean, what Paul talks about, and Apostle Paul says, the love of Christ constrains me. So this love of God descends upon your soul in a way that people are looking for in a nirvana experience or something. It's a love that is indescribable, and it's something that you've been waiting for all your life. And you just know that is the reason for my being. It's not a delusion. It's not a closing your eyes to the light. It's embracing the light. It's not a deception of the devil and a spirit of deceit, but it is a Holy Spirit. It is a spirit of love that fills your soul, for love for your neighbor and love for God. And you come to that point where you let go of all this personal agenda, and now your mission in life is to serve, and it's not to get. You're no longer trying to find happiness by getting, by seeking, by manipulating, by running from the truth. It's not about controlling others either. It's about trying to help others, yearning for others, and trying to share the love of God as much as possible. And bring down heaven, like I said earlier. So on increasing human and divine energy is bringing God's love into this world, God's truth, and it's already there, right? But we have to pay attention to it. And all we can do is live our lives as examples and try and recommend a better way than this madness of, like I said, these prejudice, these assumptions, these this manipulation and control of each other. And that's the bottom line, guys. There's really nothing else than this is the foundation of what I'm talking about. Everything else is a progression from this point. Every issue that we debate has to start at this point. Every issue that people disagree on has to come down to the sincerity. Are we absolutely sincere in our research? What is our methodology? And if we are admittedly prejudiced, then we're not trustworthy. You know, so I guess I could say so much more. Of course, this has been the subject of my life. This has been the primary focus, these particular matters in the essential things of God. Like, that's why I said the book of John is so dear to me, because it gets so deep into those things, and it contains such verses as that. Pretty much every chapter has such one or several of these very profound summaries, but this being the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does bad things hates the light and avoids it, so that his deeds may not be exposed. But anyone who lives by the truth comes to the light, so his works may be shown to be accomplished in God. So may you also find or come to that place yourself, where you can experience God working through you, not in a prejudiced way, not in all these ways that we're so familiar with seeing, all this hypocritical Christianity, all this corruption and fighting and, missing the point. And, this political stuff, and I mean, I'm not saying political stuff is wrong, but making it a political agenda, using religion to push agenda, to profit from, all these things are missing the point. And I really hope that I've been a help in this. Let me know if I have. I'm thankful for the opportunity anyway. God bless you.